Hello, horror lover. Are you ready for a long night of nightmares? Before we begin, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel, and especially leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from. I'd love to know. Click the like button, all of this because the bus lurched to a stop, its brakes squealing in protest. I blinked away the remnants of an uneasy sleep and peered out the grimy window. The Siuslaw National Forest loomed before us, a sea of green stretching as far as the eye could see. "End of the line, folks," the driver called out, his gruff voice cutting through the silence. "Siuslaw Trailhead." I stood up, stretching my cramped muscles, and reached for my backpack in the overhead compartment. As I did, my hand brushed against something sticky. I recoiled, examining my fingers in the dim light. A viscous, sap-like substance coated my skin. "Gross," I muttered, wiping my hand on my jeans. "You okay, Alex?" My best friend Mia asked from the seat behind me. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just some tree gunk or something." We filed off the bus, our group of 6 blinking in the bright afternoon sun. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. It was a welcome change from the stuffy confines of the bus. Professor Hartley, our faculty advisor, clapped his hands to get our attention. "All right, team, let's do a final gear check before we head out." As we rifled through our backpacks, I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. The forest seemed to loom over us, watchful and waiting. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was just nerves, I told myself. This was supposed to be an exciting research trip, not the setting for some horror movie. "Hey, Earth to Alex," Mia waved her hand in front of my face. "You're spacing out again." I blinked, refocusing on her concerned face. "Sorry, just taking in the scenery." She raised an eyebrow. "Right. Well, hurry up and check your gear. I want to get moving before it gets dark." We shouldered our packs and set off down the trail, Professor Hartley taking the lead. The path wound its way through towering Douglas firs and western red cedars, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. As we hiked deeper into the woods, an eerie silence descended. I noticed the absence of birdsong or the rustling of small animals. The only sound was the crunch of our boots on the leaf-strewn path and our labored breathing as we climbed a steep incline. "Is it just me, or is it really quiet?" I asked, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. Jake, our resident wildlife expert, nodded. "Yeah, it's weird. We should be hearing all sorts of animals." Professor Hartley frowned. "Perhaps there's a predator in the area. Keep your eyes open, everyone." We continued on, the silence growing more oppressive with each step. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I tried to focus on the path ahead, but my eyes kept darting to the shadows between the trees, searching for movement. After what felt like hours, we reached a small clearing. The late afternoon sun slanted through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. "We'll set up camp here for the night," Professor Hartley announced. "Alex and Mia, you're on tent duty. Jake and Sarah, gather firewood. Liam, help me set up the research equipment." As Mia and I started to unpack the tents, I noticed something strange on a nearby tree. Walking closer, I saw a series of symbols carved into the bark. They looked old, the edges smooth and weathered. "Hey, Prof," I called out. "Come look at this." Professor Hartley hurried over, his brow furrowed. He examined the markings closely, running his fingers over the grooves. "Fascinating," he murmured. "These look like they could be Native American in origin, but I've never seen symbols quite like these before." "Is this why we're here?" I asked. "To study these markings?" He shook his head. "No. Our research is focused on the unique ecosystem of this part of the forest. But this could be an important archaeological find. Or it could be some bored hikers playing a prank," Liam chimed in, joining us. "Looks like graffiti to me." Professor Hartley shot him a disapproving look. "Let's not jump to conclusions. We'll document it and report it to the proper authorities when we get back." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, we gathered around the campfire. The flames danced and crackled, providing a small circle of warmth and light in the growing darkness. "So, who wants to hear a ghost story?" Jake grinned, his face eerily illuminated by the firelight. Sarah groaned. "Really, Jake? We're in the middle of a creepy forest, and you want to tell ghost stories?" "Come on, it's tradition," he insisted. "Alex, back me up here." I shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant despite the unease gnawing at my gut. "Why not? It's not like we have anything better to do." Jake launched into a tale about a group of hikers who disappeared in these very woods, never to be seen again. As he spoke, the shadows seemed to deepen and the trees creaked and groaned in the light breeze. Suddenly, a twig snapped in the darkness beyond our campfire. We all froze, eyes wide. "What was that?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. "Probably just an animal," Professor Hartley said, but he didn't sound convinced. Another snap, closer this time, then another. "Okay, that's not funny," Liam said, standing up. "Who's out there?" Silence fell, heavy and oppressive. Even the crackling of the fire seemed muted. "I'm going to check it out," Jake announced, reaching for his flashlight. "Jake, wait," I started to say, but he was already moving towards the edge of the clearing. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the trunks of the surrounding trees. He swept it back and forth, searching for the source of the noise. "I don't see anything," he called back to us. "Must have been—" His words cut off abruptly as his flashlight beam landed on something. We all leaned forward, straining to see. "Jake?" Sarah called out. "What is it?" He didn't respond. The flashlight beam remained fixed on a spot just beyond the clearing. I stood up, my heart pounding. "Jake, come on, man, this isn't funny." Slowly, Jake turned back to face us. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Guys," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The trees, they're moving." We all turned to look where his flashlight was pointing. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but then, ever so slowly, I noticed a change. The gaps between the trees were closing. Branches were stretching out, intertwining with each other. That's not possible," Professor Hartley stammered. But as we watched in horror, the impossible became reality. The trees were moving, their trunks bending and swaying as if they were dancing to some unheard rhythm. And they were closing in around us, forming a wall of living wood. "We need to get out of here," Mia said, her voice rising in panic. "Now!" We scrambled to gather our things, but in the chaos, it was hard to find anything. The firelight flickered and dimmed, as if it too was being smothered by the encroaching forest. "The trail!" I shouted, pointing to where we had entered the clearing. "We need to get back to the trail!" But as we rushed towards it, our escape route vanished before our eyes. The trees moved with impossible speed, their branches weaving together to form an impenetrable barrier. We were trapped. As the reality of our situation sank in, a bone-chilling whisper seemed to echo through the clearing. It wasn't a voice, not really. It was more like the sound of wind through leaves, but formed into words I couldn't quite understand. I turned to my friends, seeing my own terror reflected in their eyes. The rustling of leaves jolted me from a fitful sleep. My eyes snapped open, heart racing as I tried to orient myself in the darkness of the tent. For a moment I couldn't remember where I was. Then it all came flooding back. The forest, the moving trees, the terror of the night before. I lay still, straining my ears. The rustling continued, a dry, papery sound that sent shivers down my spine. But there was something off about it. I fumbled for my watch, pressing the button to illuminate its face. 3:27 a.m. The witching hour, my grandmother would have said. Unzipping the tent as quietly as possible, I poked my head out. The clearing was bathed in pale moonlight, casting everything in an otherworldly glow. My eyes were drawn to the trees at the edge of our campsite. They were moving, swaying gently as if caught in a breeze. But there was no wind. I scrambled out of the tent, my bare feet sinking into the cool, damp earth. The trees continued their eerie dance, branches reaching and withdrawing like curious fingers. I rubbed my eyes, certain I must still be dreaming. "Alex?" Mia's voice came from behind me, thick with sleep. "What's going on?" I turned to see her emerging from our shared tent, her hair a mess and eyes squinting in the moonlight. "The trees," I whispered, pointing. "Look at the trees." She followed my gaze, her eyes widening as she took in the unnatural movement. That's not possible," she murmured, echoing Professor Hartley's words from earlier. "We need to wake the others," I said, already moving towards the other tents. Within minutes, our entire group was huddled in the center of the clearing, watching the swaying trees with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "It must be some kind of localized seismic activity," Professor Hartley suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Earthquakes don't make trees dance, Prof," Jake retorted, his usual bravado noticeably absent. Sarah hugged herself, shivering despite the mild temperature. "What do? We can't stay here." "We can't leave either," Liam pointed out. "Remember? The trees block the path." As if in response to his words, the rustling grew louder. The trees at the edge of the clearing began to sway more vigorously, their branches creaking and groaning. "Everyone, stay close," Professor Hartley ordered, his voice tight with stress. "Whatever's happening, we need to stick together." We huddled closer, watching in horrified fascination as the forest seemed to come alive around us. The moonlight cast shifting shadows that danced across the ground, making it seem as if the very earth was moving beneath our feet. Then, without warning, a blood-curdling scream shattered the night. "Sarah!" Jake yelled, whirling around. But Sarah was right beside him, her face pale with shock. That wasn't me," she stammered. "Liam," Mia gasped. "Where's Liam?" Panic set in as we realized Liam was no longer among us. How had he disappeared without any of us noticing? "Liam!" Professor Hartley shouted, his voice echoing through the clearing. "Liam, answer me." Silence fell, heavy and oppressive. Even the rustling of the trees seemed to have stopped, as if the forest was holding its breath. "We have to find him," I said, already reaching for my flashlight. "No one goes alone," Professor Hartley insisted. "We'll split into pairs. Alex and Mia, Jake and Sarah. I'll stay here in case Liam comes back. Use your whistles if you find anything or need help." We set off, the beams of our flashlights cutting through the darkness. Mia and I headed towards the eastern edge of the clearing, where we had last seen Liam standing. "Liam!" Mia called out, her voice trembling. "Liam, can you hear us?" We pushed through the underbrush, branches scraping against our arms and legs. The forest seemed denser than I remembered, the trees pressing in close, their leaves whispering secrets just beyond our understanding. "Alex, look," Mia said suddenly, grabbing my arm. Her flashlight beam illuminated a scrap of fabric caught on a low-hanging branch. It was the same color as the shirt Liam had been wearing. "Liam!" I shouted, pushing forward with renewed urgency. "Liam, where are you?" As we moved deeper into the forest, a sickly sweet smell filled the air. It reminded me of overripe fruit, with an underlying note of decay. The beam of my flashlight caught something on the ground ahead, a dark, viscous liquid pooling around the roots of a massive oak. "Oh God," Mia whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. I approached slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The liquid glistened in the flashlight beam, too thick to be water. It looked almost like sap. But sap didn't pool on the ground like this, and sap certainly didn't have the metallic tang of blood. "We need to get the others," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. Just then, a shrill whistle pierced the night. Jake and Sarah must have found something. We raced back towards the clearing, branches whipping at our faces as we ran. We burst out of the tree line to find Jake and Sarah already there, their faces ashen. "What did you find?" Professor Hartley demanded. Jake held up a tattered piece of cloth, the remains of Liam's shirt. It was covered in the same sap-like substance we had discovered. "There's more," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. We found blood. A lot of it." I described what Mia and I had seen, watching as the horror of our situation sank in for everyone. "We need to get out of here," Mia said, voicing what we were all thinking. "Now, before whatever got Liam comes back for the rest of us." We quickly packed up what we could, leaving behind anything non-essential. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, we made our way to where the trail had been the day before. But as we approached the edge of the clearing, our hopes of escape were crushed. Where there had once been a clear path, there was now an impenetrable wall of vegetation. Trees had uprooted themselves and moved, their trunks intertwining to form a barrier. Thick vines and thorny bushes filled any gaps, creating a living fortress. "No," Jake muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. No, this isn't happening." Professor Hartley approached the barrier, reaching out to touch one of the trees. As soon as his fingers made contact, the entire wall seemed to shudder, the vines writhing like snakes. He jerked his hand back, his face pale. "It's alive," he whispered. "The whole forest. It's all alive and aware." We stood there, the rising sun at our backs, staring at the impossible barrier before us. The forest that had once seemed so peaceful, so familiar, had become an alien and hostile environment. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice small and frightened. I looked around at my friends, seeing my own fear and confusion mirrored in their eyes. We were trapped in a nightmare that defied all logic and reason. Liam was missing, possibly dead, and we were at the mercy of a sentient forest that seemed to want us here for some unknown purpose. As if in response to our despair, a low moan seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath our feet. The trees began to sway again, their leaves rustling in a non-existent breeze. That whisper I had heard the night before returned, louder now, almost intelligible. "Listen," Mia said, her eyes wide. It's trying to tell us something." We stood silent, straining our ears. The whisper grew stronger, forming words that seemed to bypass our ears and speak directly to our minds. "Welcome," it seemed to say. The word carried on the rustling of 1,000 leaves. "The ritual begins." A chill ran down my spine as I realized the truth of our situation. We weren't just trapped in this forest. The sun had fully risen, but its warmth did nothing to dispel the chill that had settled in my bones. We stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the impenetrable wall of vegetation that blocked our escape. The forest's whispered words still echoed in my mind. "The ritual begins." "We can't just stand here," Jake said, breaking the stunned silence that had fallen over our group. "There has to be another way out." Professor Hartley nodded, though his eyes were distant, unfocused. "You're right. We need to keep moving. Try to find another path." "But which way?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "We don't even know where we are anymore." I pulled out my phone, already knowing it would be useless. As expected, there was no signal. The GPS app couldn't locate us either, as if the forest itself was blocking any connection to the outside world. "We could try going north," Mia suggested, pointing to where the sun had risen. "If we keep the sun on our right, we should eventually hit a road or a town." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all we had. We gathered our belongings and set off, pushing through the dense underbrush. The forest seemed to press in around us, the trees looming overhead, their branches reaching down like gnarled fingers. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig under our feet, seemed unnaturally loud. The forest was alive in a way I had never experienced before, and it was terrifying. "Does anyone else feel like the trees are moving?" Sarah whispered after we'd been walking for what felt like hours. I glanced around, realizing with a start that she was right. The trees seemed to be slowly closing in, their trunks bending ever so slightly towards us. "It's just your imagination," Professor Hartley said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Trees don't move. Tell that to the ones that trapped us here, Jake muttered. We pressed on, our pace quickening. The undergrowth became thicker, thorny vines catching at our clothes and scratching our skin. It was as if the forest was trying to hold us back, to keep us from escaping. Suddenly, Mia stumbled, crying out in pain. "My ankle," she gasped, clutching at her leg. "I think I twisted it." I knelt beside her, examining her swollen ankle. "It doesn't look broken, but you shouldn't put weight on it," I said. "We need to rest." "We can't stop," Jake argued, his eyes darting nervously around the forest. "We have to keep moving." "We won't get far with Mia injured," I countered. "We need to find a safe place to rest and regroup." As if in answer to my words, the trees ahead of us suddenly parted, revealing a small clearing. At its center stood a large, flat stone, its surface covered in strange, swirling symbols. "What is that?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide. Professor Hartley approached the stone cautiously, his academic curiosity momentarily overriding his fear. "It looks like an altar of some kind," he murmured, running his hand over the carved symbols. "These markings, they're unlike anything I've ever seen." We helped Mia to the clearing, settling her on a fallen log near the altar. As we caught our breath, I noticed something odd about the clearing. Unlike the rest of the forest, which seemed to be constantly in motion, the trees here were perfectly still. "It's quiet," I said, realizing what was bothering me. Too quiet. As soon as the words left my mouth, a ghostly whisper filled the air. It was the same voice we had heard earlier, but now it was speaking in a language I didn't recognize. The words seemed to curl around us, chilling me to the bone. "What's it saying?" Mia asked, her face pale. Professor Hartley shook his head. "I don't know. It's not any language I'm familiar with." The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The symbols on the altar began to glow with a faint, pulsing light. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice tight with fear. "Now." But as we turned to leave, we found our path blocked. The trees had moved again, forming a solid wall around the clearing. Their branches writhed and twisted, weaving together to create an impenetrable barrier. "No!" Sarah cried, running to the wall of trees and pushing against them. "Let us out." The trees didn't budge. Instead, they seemed to grow even denser, closing off any hope of escape. "We're trapped," I said, the realization sinking in like a stone in my gut. The whispers continued, growing more rhythmic, almost like a chant. The glow from the altar intensified, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. "What do they want from us?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Professor Hartley turned back to the altar, studying the glowing symbols intently. I think they want us to perform some kind of ritual," he said slowly. "A ritual?" Jake scoffed. "You can't be serious." "Look at the symbols," Professor Hartley insisted. "They're arranged in a specific pattern. And this indentation here," he pointed to a shallow bowl carved into the center of the altar. "It looks like it's meant to hold something." "Hold what?" I asked, dreading the answer. The professor's face was grim. "If I had to guess, blood." A horrified silence fell over our group. The implications of his words were too terrible to contemplate. "No way," Jake said, shaking his head vehemently. "No way are we doing some creepy blood ritual." "We might not have a choice," I said, looking around at the writhing wall of trees surrounding us. "We're trapped here. And remember what happened to Liam." The memory of the sap-like blood we had found hung heavy in the air. None of us wanted to consider the possibility that the forest might take another of us if we didn't comply with its demands. "So what? We just cut ourselves and bleed on this rock?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "And then what?" Professor Hartley shook his head. "I don't know, but I think it's our only chance of getting out of here alive." The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The trees seemed to press closer, their branches reaching towards us like grasping hands. "We need to decide quickly," Mia said, wincing as she tried to stand on her injured ankle. I don't think the forest is going to wait much longer. I looked around at my friends, seeing the fear and uncertainty in their eyes. We were trapped in a nightmare, forced to make an impossible choice. Perform a ritual we didn't understand with potentially dire consequences, or face whatever punishment the forest had in store for us. "I'll do it," I said, stepping forward. "I'll start the ritual." "Alex, no," Mia protested, reaching for my hand. "We don't know what it will do to you." I gave her hand a squeeze, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. "We don't have any other choice, and someone has to go first." As I approached the altar, the whispers reached a fever pitch. The symbols glowed brighter, pulsing in time with my racing heart. I pulled out my pocket knife, my hand shaking as I opened the blade. "Here goes nothing," I muttered, pressing the blade to my palm. As the first drop of blood fell into the carved bowl, the forest exploded into motion. The trees thrashed wildly, their branches whipping through the air. The whispers became a roar, the unknown words pounding in my head. I felt a surge of energy course through me, unlike anything I had ever experienced. The world seemed to shift and warp around me, reality bending in impossible ways. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The forest fell silent. The glow from the altar faded. I looked up, meeting the wide-eyed stares of my friends. What just happened?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Before anyone could answer, the wall of trees behind me parted, revealing a new path. "I think," Professor Hartley said slowly, "the forest is showing us where to go next." As we gathered our things, preparing to venture down this new path, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just taken our first step into something far bigger and more dangerous than we could possibly imagine. The forest had accepted my blood, but at what cost? And what other trials lay ahead of us in this living, breathing maze? With a deep breath, I stepped onto the new path, my friends close behind. Whatever challenges the forest had in store for us, we would face them together. The new path led us deeper into the heart of the forest. The trees here were older, their trunks massive and gnarled, their canopies so dense that only slivers of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. "This part of the forest feels different," Mia said, her voice hushed. She was limping slightly, still favoring her injured ankle. I nodded, feeling it too. There was a palpable sense of age here, of ancient secrets buried beneath layers of time and foliage. The whispers that had haunted us earlier were gone, replaced by an expectant silence. "Keep your eyes open," Professor Hartley advised. "If this truly is sacred ground, there may be more artifacts or structures like the altar we found." We moved slowly, our senses on high alert. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat, every rustle of leaves a harbinger of danger. The events of the past day had left us all on edge, jumping at the slightest sound. As we rounded a bend in the path, Sarah suddenly stopped short. "Look," she said, pointing to a massive oak tree ahead of us. "There's something odd about that tree." We approached cautiously. The oak was truly enormous, its trunk easily 10 feet in diameter. But what caught our attention was a peculiar opening about halfway up, a hollow that seemed unnaturally symmetrical. Jake squinted up at it. "It almost looks like a door?" Before anyone could stop him, he began to climb. The rest of us watched nervously as he made his way up the gnarled trunk. "Be careful," Mia called out. Jake reached the hollow and peered inside. "There's something in here," he called down. "It looks like a book." He reached in and pulled out a leather-bound volume, its cover stained and cracked with age. As he did, something shifted inside the tree. There was a groaning sound, like wood straining against a great weight. "Jake, get down from there," Professor Hartley shouted. Jake scrambled down just as a shower of debris fell from the hollow. Rotted wood, dead leaves, and what looked disturbingly like fragments of bone. He landed hard, the book clutched to his chest. "Are you okay?" I asked, helping him to his feet. He nodded, brushing himself off. Yeah, I think so. But look at this. He held out the book. It was an old journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. The cover bore a single word in faded gilt lettering. Sciuslaw. Professor Hartley took the journal, handling it with reverent care. This could be an invaluable historical document, he said, his academic excitement momentarily overriding his fear. Let's see what it says. We gathered around as he carefully opened the journal. The first page bore a date, June 15th, 1872, and the name Thomas Blackwood. I have come to this forest at the behest of the Sciuslaw tribe, Professor Hartley read aloud. They speak of ancient spirits that dwell among these trees, spirits that must be appeased lest they bring ruin upon the land. A chill ran down my spine. The writer's words seemed to echo our own experiences. The tribe's shaman has shown me their sacred sites, the professor continued. Stone altars hidden deep in the woods, where they perform rituals of blood and bone. I confess, I find their practices barbaric, yet I cannot deny the power that thrums through this forest. Blood and bone, Mia whispered, like the ritual we performed. Professor Hartley flipped through the pages, scanning quickly. It seems Blackwood spent several months with the tribe documenting their beliefs and practices. But listen to this entry from near the end. I fear I have made a grave error. In my zeal to understand the tribe's rituals, I performed one myself upon their sacred altar. The forest. It changed. The trees move of their own accord. Strange whispers fill the air. The tribe's shaman warns of dire consequences for those who disturb the sacred sites without proper preparation and respect. I must find a way to make amends, or I fear I may never leave this forest alive. A heavy silence fell over our group as the implications of Blackwood's words sank in. We've done the same thing, Sarah said, her voice trembling. We performed a ritual without knowing what we were doing. And now we're trapped here, Jake added grimly. I felt a surge of guilt. It had been my blood that started the ritual. This is my fault, I said. I should never have... No, Alex, Mia interrupted, placing a hand on my arm. We were all part of this. We all chose to come here. Professor Hartley was still poring over the journal. There's more, he said. Blackwood writes about a way to appease the forest spirits. A more complex ritual, performed at the main altar. Where's the main altar? I asked. The professor shook his head. He doesn't say exactly, but he mentions it's at the heart of the forest where the oldest trees grow. Just then, a cold breeze swept through the clearing, causing us all to shiver. I turned, and my heart nearly stopped. There, at the edge of the trees, stood a spectral figure. It was translucent, barely visible but unmistakably human in shape. Guys, I whispered, not daring to look away. Do you see that? They turned, and I heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath. The figure raised an arm pointing deeper into the forest. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. Was that a ghost? Jake asked, his usual bravado completely gone. I think, Professor Hartley said slowly, it was trying to show us the way. We stood there for a moment, processing what we had just seen. The forest around us seemed to hold its breath, waiting for our decision. We have to follow it, I said finally. It's our only chance of finding the main altar and figuring out how to fix this. Mia nodded, her face pale but determined. Alex is right. We can't stay here, and we can't go back. Forward is our only option. With great care, Professor Hartley tucked the journal into his backpack. This may be our guide to understanding what's happening and how to stop it, he said. We must protect it at all costs. We gathered our things and set off in the direction the spectral figure had indicated. The path was barely visible, overgrown with ferns and moss, but we could feel that we were heading in the right direction. The forest seemed to part before us, guiding our steps. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Not with malice exactly, but with an intense ancient curiosity. We had stumbled into a world far older and stranger than we had ever imagined, and now we were part of its story. "What do you think the ritual will involve?" Sarah asked, breaking the tense silence. Professor Hartley sighed. "I'm not sure. Blackwood's journal mentions blood, certainly, but also speaks of offerings and complex invocations. We'll need to study it more carefully when we reach the altar." "And what if we can't figure it out?" Jake asked. "What if we get it wrong?" No one had an answer for that. The consequences of failure were too terrible to contemplate. As we pushed deeper into the forest, the trees grew even larger, their trunks wider than cars, their branches forming a cathedral-like canopy high above. The air grew thick and misty, and strange, luminescent fungi clung to the bark, casting an eerie glow. Suddenly, Mia gasped. "Look," she said, pointing ahead. Through the mist, we could just make out the shape of a massive stone structure. As we drew closer, its details became clear. It was an enormous altar, easily 20 feet across, carved with intricate symbols that seemed to shift and move as we watched. "This is it," Professor Hartley breathed. "The main altar." We approached slowly, our hearts pounding. The air around the altar seemed to shimmer, as if we were looking at it through a heat haze. The whispers we had heard before returned, growing louder as we neared. As we reached the edge of the clearing, the spectral figure appeared again. This time, it was clearer, more defined. I could make out the features of an old man, his face lined with wisdom and sorrow. He gestured to the altar, then to us, his meaning clear. It was time for us to complete the ritual, to make amends for our unwitting trespass. "What do we do?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "We do what we came here to do," I said. "We follow Blackwood's instructions, and we hope it's enough to appease the forest." As we stepped towards the altar, the whispers rose to a crescendo. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if we would succeed where others had failed. Whatever happened next, I knew our lives would never be the same. We had entered the heart of an ancient mystery, and now we had to see it through to the end. The massive stone altar loomed before us, its surface covered in intricate swirling patterns that seemed to shift and change as we watched. The air around it shimmered with an otherworldly energy, and the whispers of the forest grew more insistent, almost deafening in their intensity. Professor Hartley carefully extracted Blackwood's journal from his backpack, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. "All right," he said, his voice barely audible over the forest's murmurs. "Let's see what Blackwood has to say about this ritual." We huddled around him, our eyes darting nervously between the journal and the surrounding trees. The forest seemed to press in closer, watching, waiting. "The appeasement ritual," Professor Hartley read aloud, "requires 5 participants, 1 for each of the cardinal directions and 1 to stand at the center. Each must offer something of themselves to the forest." "Offer something of ourselves?" Sarah repeated, her voice trembling. "What does that mean?" The professor continued reading. "Blood is required, yes, but also something more. A personal sacrifice, a piece of one's essence. The forest demands not just physical offerings, but spiritual ones as well." Jake ran a hand through his hair, his face pale. "This is insane. We can't actually be considering this, can we?" "Do we have a choice?" I asked, looking around at the others. "We're trapped here. If this is our only way out..." Mia nodded, her expression resolute despite the fear in her eyes. "We have to try. For Liam, if nothing else." Professor Hartley flipped through a few more pages. Blackwood describes the materials needed for the ritual. We'll need 5 white candles, a bowl of pure water, some kind of blade, and various plants and herbs from the forest itself. "I can handle the plants," Mia offered. "I've been studying botany. I should be able to identify what we need." "Good," the professor nodded. "Jake and Sarah, you 2 gather anything we can use for candles from our supplies. Alex, you're with me. We need to find a suitable blade and prepare the altar." We split up. each focused on our tasks. As Mia ventured into the underbrush to gather the required plants, I helped Professor Hartley clear the altar's surface. Years of debris had accumulated on it, and as we brushed it away, the carved symbols beneath began to glow faintly. "Professor," I said, my voice low, "do you really think this will work?" He paused in his work, his eyes meeting mine. "I don't know, Alex. But I do know that we're dealing with forces far beyond our understanding. At this point, faith may be our strongest asset." As we worked, the forest around us seemed to come alive. The trees swayed gently, though there was no wind. Strange, glowing fungi pulsed with an inner light. Even the ground beneath our feet seemed to thrum with energy. After what felt like hours, we reconvened at the altar. Mia had returned with an armful of various plants, their leaves glistening with an unnatural sheen. Jake and Sarah had managed to fashion crude candles from some emergency supplies in our backpacks. "Now what?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Professor Hartley consulted the journal once more. "We need to arrange ourselves around the altar. North, south, east, west, and center. The candles should be placed at each point, and the bowl of water in the middle." We positioned ourselves as instructed, the tension in the air palpable. I found myself standing at the northern point, the cold stone of the altar pressing against my palms. "The ritual begins with an invocation," the professor continued. "We must speak it together. Spirits of the ancient forest, we come before you as supplicants. We ask for your forgiveness, and offer ourselves in exchange for safe passage." We repeated the words, our voices joining together in a shaky chorus. As we spoke, the symbols on the altar began to glow brighter, pulsing in time with our words. "Now," Professor Hartley said, his voice strained, "we each must make our offering. Blood first, then, whatever personal sacrifice you deem appropriate." Jake went first, drawing the blade across his palm with a wince. As his blood dripped onto the altar, he spoke. "I offer my strength," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "The power I've always relied on, I now surrender to the forest." The trees around us shuddered, their leaves rustling in a non-existent breeze. Sarah was next. Her hand shook as she cut her palm, but her voice was steady. "I offer my fear," she said. "The terror that has gripped me since we entered this place. I give it to the forest freely." A low moan seemed to emanate from the earth itself, as if the forest was accepting her offering. Mia stepped forward, her face pale but determined. She let her blood fall onto the altar and closed her eyes. "I offer my knowledge," she said. "The understanding of nature I've worked so hard to gain, I now return to its source." The glowing fungi around us pulsed brighter, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. It was my turn. I took the blade, its edge glinting in the strange, otherworldly light. As my blood joined the others on the altar's surface, I spoke. "I offer my future," I said, the words coming unbidden to my lips. "Whatever path my life was meant to take, I now place in the hands of the forest." The whispers that had been our constant companion grew louder, almost deafening. The trees began to sway more violently, their branches reaching towards us. Professor Hartley was last. His hand was steady as he made the cut, his blood mingling with ours. "I offer my skepticism," he said, his voice ringing out clear and strong. "The disbelief that has blinded me to the wonders and terrors of this world I now abandon." As soon as the words left his mouth, the forest erupted into chaos. The ground beneath our feet began to tremble, and the trees thrashed wildly, their branches whipping through the air. The symbols on the altar blazed with blinding light, and the bowl of water at the center began to boil and steam. "Don't break the circle," Professor Hartley shouted over the din. "Whatever happens, stay in position." The tremors grew stronger, and I struggled to keep my footing. The forest's whispers had become a roar, the words indecipherable but filled with ancient power. Suddenly, Sarah cried out. "I can't!" she screamed, her face contorted in terror. "It's too much!" She stumbled backwards, breaking the circle. The moment she moved, the forest's fury intensified. The ground split open near the altar, steam and a foul odor rising from the crack. The trees bent towards us, their branches grasping like clawed hands. "Sarah, get back in position!" I yelled, reaching out to her. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do it, I can't!" Mia made a split-second decision. She lunged forward, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her back to the altar. "Yes, you can," she said fiercely. "We're in this together, remember?" With trembling steps, Sarah resumed her place. As soon as the circle was complete again, the forest's onslaught lessened slightly. The ground stopped shaking, though the trees continued their frenzied dance. "We need to finish the ritual," Professor Hartley called out. "Together now, repeat after me. We have given of ourselves freely. We ask for passage, for forgiveness, for understanding." We chanted the words, our voices growing stronger with each repetition. The light from the altar grew brighter and brighter until it was painful to look at. The roar of the forest rose to a crescendo, and then silence. The light faded, the trees stilled, the whispers ceased. We stood there panting, our hands still pressed to the cold stone of the altar. Blood mingled with sweat and tears on its surface. "Did it work?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse. No one answered. We looked around, searching for some sign, some indication that our offerings had been accepted. But the forest remained still and silent. No spectral figure appeared to guide us. No path opened up before us. "What now?" Mia asked, the question we were all thinking. Professor Hartley shook his head slowly. "I don't know," he admitted. "The journal doesn't say what's supposed to happen after the ritual. I suppose we just wait." And so we waited, the silence of the forest pressing in around us, leaving us suspended in terrified anticipation. Had we succeeded in appeasing the ancient spirits? Or had we only angered them further? As the adrenaline of the ritual faded, exhaustion set in. We slumped to the ground around the altar, too drained to even speak. The forest watched us, its intentions as inscrutable as ever. All we could do now was wait, and hope that when the forest finally stirred again, it would be with mercy rather than wrath. Hours passed in tense silence. The forest remained unnaturally still, as if holding its breath. We huddled near the altar, exhausted and on edge, jumping at every small sound. As the initial shock of the ritual wore off, the reality of our situation began to sink in. We were still trapped, with no clear path forward. The strain started to show. "This is ridiculous," Jake muttered, pacing back and forth. "We did their stupid ritual. Why aren't we out of here yet?" Sarah hugged her knees to her chest, rocking slightly. "Maybe we did it wrong. Maybe we're stuck here forever." "Don't say that," Mia snapped, her usual calm demeanor cracking. "We can't give up now." I stood up, stretching my stiff muscles. "We need to stay focused. There has to be something we're missing." Professor Hartley hadn't moved from his position by the altar, his eyes fixed on Blackwood's journal. There must be more information here, something we overlooked. As he flipped through the pages, a small piece of paper fluttered to the ground. I bent to pick it up, my eyes widening as I read the handwritten note. "Guys," I said slowly, "you need to see this." They gathered around as I read aloud. "To whoever finds this journal, beware the Seoslaw forest. Its spirits are real and unforgiving. If you have come here seeking the truth, turn back now. Some secrets are better left buried." A heavy silence fell over the group. "Where did that come from?" Mia asked, her voice hushed. I turned to Professor Hartley, a sick feeling growing in my stomach. "Professor, did you know about this?" He wouldn't meet my eyes. I found it when we first discovered the journal. I didn't think it was important." "Didn't think it was important?" Jake exploded. "We're trapped in a goddamn haunted forest, and you didn't think a warning about its spirits was important?" The professor stood up, his face flushed. I'm a man of science. I couldn't believe that some superstitious nonsense from over a century ago could have any bearing on our situation. Superstitious nonsense? Sarah cried. Have you not been paying attention to what's happening around us? As accusations flew back and forth, I noticed Mia had gone very quiet. She was staring at the ground, her face pale. Mia? I asked, touching her arm. What's wrong? She flinched at my touch. I knew, she whispered. The arguing stopped abruptly as everyone turned to look at her. What do you mean, you knew? I asked, dreading the answer. Mia took a shaky breath. My grandmother, she was Siuslaw. She used to tell me stories about this forest, about the spirits that lived here. I always thought they were just legends, but... You knew? Jake's voice was dangerously quiet. You knew about all of this and you didn't say anything? Mia's eyes filled with tears. I didn't think they were real. I thought it was just old superstition. I didn't want everyone to think I was crazy. The tension in the air was palpable. Jake took a step towards Mia, his fists clenched. Do you have any idea what you've done? Liam is gone because of you. I stepped between them. Back off, Jake. This isn't helping. No. What isn't helping is people keeping secrets that could get us all killed. He shoved me hard, sending me stumbling backwards. Chaos erupted. Jake lunged at Mia, but Professor Hartley intercepted him. Sarah was screaming for everyone to stop. In the confusion, I lost my balance and fell against the altar. Time seemed to slow down as I watched Blackwood's journal, our only guide in this nightmare, slide off the stone surface and into the crack that had opened during the ritual. No, I cried, reaching for it, but it was too late. The journal disappeared into the earth, swallowed by the forest. The moment it vanished, the trees around us exploded into motion. Branches whipped through the air like angry serpents. The ground shook violently, nearly knocking us off our feet. What's happening? Sarah screamed over the din. Before anyone could answer, a massive root erupted from the ground, wrapping itself around Jake's leg. He barely had time to cry out before he was yanked off his feet and dragged into the underbrush. Jake! Mia shouted, reaching for him, but Professor Hartley held her back. We can't help him, he yelled. We have to finish the ritual. But the journal is gone, I shouted back. How are we supposed to finish it? The professor's face was grim. We'll have to do it from memory. It's our only chance. We scrambled back to our positions around the altar, the violent shaking of the earth making it hard to keep our footing. The trees pressed in closer, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out what little light remained. What do we do? Sarah cried, her voice tinged with panic. Professor Hartley closed his eyes, concentrating. We need to make another offering. Something more significant than before. More significant how? I asked, my heart pounding. He opened his eyes, his gaze meeting each of ours in turn. The forest has taken 2 of us. I think it wants 1 more. A horrified silence fell over us, broken only by the creaking and groaning of the angry forest around us. You can't be serious, Mia whispered. I am, the professor said gravely. One of us needs to offer ourselves to the forest, willingly. The implications of his words sank in. We looked at each other, the same thought reflected in everyone's eyes. Who would it be? I'll do it, I said, the words leaving my mouth before I could think better of it. Alex, no, Mia cried, reaching for me. I shook my head. It has to be me. I started this when I performed the first ritual. I have to finish it. We can find another way, Sarah pleaded. But I knew there was no other way. I could feel it in my bones, in the very air around us. The forest was waiting, and it would not be denied. Tell my family I love them, I said, stepping towards the center of the altar. The others watched in horror as I raised the ritual blade. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I offer myself to the forest, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. My life for the lives of my friends. My future for their safe passage. I closed my eyes, the blade poised over my heart. This was it. The final sacrifice. But before I could plunge the blade down, Mia's voice rang out. "Wait!" I opened my eyes to see her step forward, her face set with determination. "It should be me," she said. "My grandmother's people made a pact with this forest long ago. It's my heritage, my responsibility." "Mia, no," I started to protest, but she cut me off. "I kept the truth from you all. This is my fault. Let me make it right." Before anyone could stop her, she grabbed the blade from my hand and drew it across her palm. Blood welled up, dripping onto the altar. "I offer myself to the forest," she said, her voice ringing with power. "My life, my knowledge, my very essence. I return to the earth that bore my ancestors." The moment her blood touched the stone, the forest erupted into motion once more. But this time it wasn't violent. The trees swayed gently, their leaves rustling in a non-existent breeze. The ground stopped shaking. The oppressive darkness lifted, and then, to our amazement, Mia began to glow. It started as a faint shimmer but quickly grew brighter. She turned to us, her eyes wide with wonder and fear. "I can feel it," she whispered. "The forest, it's accepting me." We watched in awe as the glow intensified. Mia's form began to blur, becoming translucent. She reached out to us, a sad smile on her face. "Thank you," she said, her voice already sounding distant. "For everything." And then, in a flash of blinding light, she was gone. Where she had stood, a young sapling now grew, its leaves the same rich brown as Mia's eyes. The forest sighed, a sound of contentment. The trees parted, revealing a clear path leading out of the clearing. We stood there in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. Mia was gone, but her sacrifice had saved us all. "We should go," Professor Hartley said softly, after what felt like an eternity. "The forest has granted us passage. We shouldn't linger." With heavy hearts, we gathered what remained of our belongings. As we prepared to leave, I turned back to the sapling that had been Mia. I placed my hand gently on its trunk, feeling a warmth that was achingly familiar. "Goodbye, Mia," I whispered. "We'll never forget you." As we walked down the newly revealed path, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Not with malevolence, but with a sort of ancient, inscrutable curiosity. The forest had changed us, marked us. We had entered as trespassers and were leaving as something else. What awaited us beyond the forest's edge, I didn't know. The path out of the forest seemed endless. We walked in silence, each lost in our own thoughts, the weight of Mia's sacrifice heavy on our hearts. The trees around us had stopped their eerie movements, but the air still thrummed with an otherworldly energy. As we rounded a bend, the spectral figure we had seen earlier materialized before us, blocking our path. Its form was clearer now, revealing the weathered face of an old man, his eyes filled with ancient wisdom and sorrow. "You have completed part of the ritual," the figure spoke, its voice like rustling leaves. "But the forest is not yet satisfied." Professor Hartley stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "What more does it want from us? We've already lost 2 of our friends." The specter's eyes narrowed. "The forest demands balance. A willing sacrifice of blood must be made to complete the ritual and seal the pact." Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. But we've already given our blood." Mia gave her life. The ghostly figure shook its head slowly. "The forest requires a final offering. One of you must willingly give your life to appease the ancient spirits." A heavy silence fell over our group as the implications of the specter's words sank in. We looked at each other, fear and desperation clear in everyone's eyes. "This is insane," I muttered, running a hand through my hair. "We can't just sacrifice one of us." Jake, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since his near abduction, spoke up. "Maybe we should, if it's the only way out." "You can't be serious," Sarah cried, her voice rising in panic. We're not murderers. Professor Hartley held up his hands, trying to calm the situation. Let's think about this rationally. There has to be another way. But as we stood there, arguing and pleading, I could feel the forest's patience wearing thin. The trees began to sway again, their branches reaching towards us like grasping fingers. We're running out of time, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We need to make a decision. Jake stepped forward, his face set in grim determination. I'll do it. This whole mess started because of my stupid idea to come here in the first place. No, Sarah protested, grabbing his arm. You can't. I need you. Jake turned to her, surprise and something softer flickering across his face. Sarah, I'll do it, Professor Hartley interrupted. I'm the oldest. I've lived my life. I shook my head. Professor, no. You have knowledge that the world needs. Your research, your experiences. As we argued, each of us offering ourselves while the others protested, our deepest fears and secrets began to spill out. I can't go back, Sarah cried, tears streaming down her face. My parents, they'll never understand. They'll force me to be someone I'm not. Jake's tough exterior cracked. I'm a fraud, he admitted. All my bravado, my confidence, it's all an act. I'm terrified all the time. Professor Hartley's shoulders slumped. My life's work, it's based on a lie. I've known about the supernatural for years, but I was too afraid to admit it, too afraid of losing my credibility. As they spoke, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I looked at my friends, seeing them clearly perhaps for the first time. We had all come into this forest carrying our own burdens, our own secrets. And now, faced with the ultimate choice, those burdens were being laid bare. I'll do it, I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. They all turned to look at me, their arguments dying on their lips. Alex, no, Sarah pleaded. You can't. I gave her a sad smile. I have to. You all have reasons to live, things to go back to. Me? I've always felt like I was waiting for something, some greater purpose. Maybe this is it. Before anyone could stop me, I stepped towards the altar. My legs were trembling, but my resolve was firm. The spectral figure watched impassively as I approached. I offer myself to the forest, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. My life for the lives of my friends. I picked up the ritual knife, its blade glinting in the strange, filtered light of the forest. As I raised it to my palm, preparing to make the final cut, a memory suddenly flashed through my mind. It was Mia's voice, from what felt like a lifetime ago. We had been sitting around a campfire on a different trip, long before this nightmare began. She had been telling us stories her grandmother had taught her. In the old rituals, Mia's voice echoed in my mind. It was never about the blood itself. It was about the intent behind the offering, the willingness to sacrifice, not the sacrifice itself. My hand froze, the knife a hair's breadth from my skin. Wait, I said, turning to the spectral figure. It's not about the blood, is it? It's about the willingness to sacrifice. The ghost's expression didn't change, but I sensed a shift in the air around us. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The ritual, I continued, the words tumbling out as the realization hit me. It's not complete because we haven't truly understood the sacrifice. We've been thinking about it all wrong. I turned to my friends, seeing confusion and hope warring on their faces. Don't you see? We've all been willing to die for each other. But that's not what the forest wants. It wants us to live for each other. I dropped the knife, letting it clatter to the ground. I offer myself to the forest, I said again, but this time with a different intent. Not my death, but my life. I pledge to live in harmony with nature, to protect these ancient woods and the secrets they hold, to honor the sacrifice Mia made. As I spoke, I felt a change come over me. A warmth spread through my body, starting from my heart and radiating outwards. The trees around us began to sway, but not in the menacing way they had before. Now it was almost joyful. "That's it," Professor Hartley breathed, understanding dawning on his face. "The forest doesn't want us to die. It wants us to live, but with a new purpose." One by one, my friends stepped forward, each making their own pledge. "I offer my knowledge," Professor Hartley said. "I will dedicate my life to understanding and protecting places like this, bridging the gap between science and the supernatural." Jake stepped up next. "I offer my strength," he said, his voice firm. "Not for myself, but to defend these forests and the secrets they hold." Sarah was last, her eyes shining with tears, but a smile on her face. "I offer my voice," she said. "I'll tell the world about what we've seen here, make them understand the importance of preserving these ancient places." As the last words were spoken, the forest erupted into motion. But this time it wasn't chaotic or frightening. The trees swayed in a beautiful rhythmic dance. Flowers bloomed before our eyes, their petals unfurling in seconds. The air filled with the songs of birds that had been eerily absent before. The spectral figure nodded, a smile touching its translucent lips. "The pact is sealed," it said. "You have learned the true meaning of sacrifice. Go now, with the blessing of the forest." As the ghost faded away, the trees parted, revealing a clear path out of the forest. Sunlight streamed through, warm and welcoming. We looked at each other, a mix of relief, exhaustion, and wonder on our faces. We had entered this forest as naive researchers, blind to the ancient powers that existed in the world. We were leaving as guardians, forever changed by our experiences. As we took our first steps towards the exit, I felt a presence behind me. Turning, I saw the sapling that had grown from Mia's sacrifice. It had grown, its branches reaching towards us. "Thank you, Mia," I whispered, touching a leaf gently. "We'll never forget." With one last look at the forest that had nearly claimed our lives, but had instead given us a new purpose, we stepped out into the sunlight. The adventure that had brought us to the brink of death was over, but I knew that our true journey was just beginning. The Siuslaw forest had changed us, marked us. As we stepped onto the path revealed by the parting trees, a sense of relief washed over us. We had survived the ritual, made our pledges, and the forest seemed to have accepted our offerings. But our ordeal was far from over. The path ahead shimmered like a mirage, twisting and changing before our eyes. The air grew thick with an otherworldly mist, and an eerie silence fell over the forest once more. "Something's not right," Professor Hartley muttered, his brow furrowed with concern. Before any of us could respond, the spectral figure materialized before us again, its form more solid than before. "You have made your pledges," it intoned, its voice echoing unnaturally. "Now you must prove your worth. The forest demands a test of your resolve." Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling but determined. "We've already been through so much. What more could you possibly want from us?" The ghost's eyes, deep and unfathomable, fixed upon her. "The forest must know the true measure of your hearts. You will each face a trial, born from your deepest fears. Only by conquering these fears can you truly be worthy of the forest's trust." As the specter's words faded, the mist around us thickened, swirling into impenetrable walls that separated us from each other. "Alex," I heard Jake call out, his voice muffled and distant. "Professor, Sarah." "Stay calm," I shouted back, though my own heart was racing. "We'll find each other." But even as the words left my mouth, the mist before me cleared, revealing a scene that made my blood run cold. I was standing on the edge of the impossibly high cliff, the ground beneath my feet crumbling away with each passing second. Heights, my greatest fear. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. This couldn't be real. We were in a forest, not on a mountain. But every sense told me the danger was real, the drop before me fatal. From somewhere in the distance, I heard Sarah scream. The sound jolted me out of my panic. My friends needed me. I couldn't let this illusion, no matter how real it felt, stop me. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to look over the edge of the cliff. Far below, I could see my friends, each trapped in their own nightmarish scenario. Sarah was surrounded by a crowd of people, all shouting and pointing at her. Her fear of judgment and rejection made manifest. Jake was alone in what looked like a vast, empty wasteland, the embodiment of his hidden fear of isolation. And Professor Hartley stood before a giant chalkboard covered in equations that constantly shifted and changed, representing his fear of academic failure and irrelevance. "It's not real," I muttered to myself, clenching my fists. "It's just a test. I can beat this." Summoning every ounce of courage I possessed, I took a step forward, then another. The cliff edge crumbled beneath my feet, but I kept moving. As I neared the edge, I closed my eyes and jumped. For a heart-stopping moment, I felt nothing but air around me. Then my feet hit solid ground. I opened my eyes to find myself standing next to Sarah in her nightmare scenario. "Sarah!" I called out, reaching for her. "It's not real. You have to fight it." She turned to me, her eyes wide with terror. "Alex, how did you get here? Can't you see them? They're all judging me, hating me." I grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at me. "No one is judging you. It's the forest, creating your worst fear. You're stronger than this, Sarah. Remember your pledge." Recognition flickered in her eyes. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and turned to face the illusory crowd. "I am not defined by your judgment," she declared, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I am who I am, and I'm proud of it." As she spoke, the crowd began to fade, dissolving into mist. Sarah turned to me, a look of triumph on her face. But before we could celebrate, the mist swirled again, and we found ourselves in Jake's barren wasteland. We found him curled up on the ground, muttering to himself. Alone. Always alone. "Jake!" Sarah cried, rushing to his side. "You're not alone. We're here." It took both of us to break through Jake's illusion, reminding him of his strength and the connections he'd forged with us. As his nightmare faded, we turned our attention to Professor Hartley. We found him frantically scribbling on the ever-changing chalkboard, his forehead beaded with sweat. "I can't keep up," he was saying, his voice edged with panic. "It's all slipping away." "Professor," I said firmly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Your worth isn't measured by equations or academic achievements. Remember why we're here. Remember what you pledged to the forest." Slowly, the professor lowered his chalk. He turned to us, clarity returning to his eyes. "You're right," he said softly. "There's so much more to learn, to discover. My journey is far from over." As the chalkboard faded away, we found ourselves back on the forest path, reunited and unharmed. But the trials weren't over. The mist coalesced once more, forming a new horror uniquely tailored to me. I saw my friends walking away, leaving me behind. I heard their voices, dismissive and cruel, saying they'd never really cared for me, that I was worthless, unnecessary. My heart clenched, but I stood my ground. "No," I said firmly. "This isn't real. My friends wouldn't do this. We've been through too much together." I turned to where I knew my real friends stood, even though I couldn't see them through the illusion. "I trust you," I declared. "I believe in the bonds we've forged. No fear can break that." The illusion shattered like glass, leaving us standing together on the path once more. We looked at each other, exhausted but triumphant. The spectral figure appeared before us one last time. "You have faced your fears and emerged victorious," it said, a note of approval in its ethereal voice. "But for you, Alex, there is one final test." Before I could react, the world around me dissolved. I found myself floating in a void, surrounded by pinpricks of light that I somehow knew were stars. Before me, a massive tree materialized, its branches stretching out to infinity, its roots delving into the very fabric of reality. "Behold," The specter's voice echoed around me. The true nature of the forest. Understanding flooded through me. The forest wasn't just a collection of trees. It was a nexus, a point where multiple realities converged. The trials we had faced, the magic we had witnessed, it was all part of something far greater than we had imagined. The forest stands at the crossroads of worlds, the voice continued. It must be protected, for if it falls, the consequences will echo across realities. Images flashed before my eyes. Other worlds, other times, all connected by the cosmic tree before me. I saw the delicate balance that the forest maintained, and the catastrophic results if that balance were to be disrupted. "Do you understand now?" the voice asked. "Do you accept the responsibility that comes with this knowledge?" I thought of everything we had been through, the sacrifices we had made, the fears we had overcome. I thought of Mia, who had given her life to save us, and I knew there was only one answer I could give. "I understand," I said, my voice ringing with certainty. "I accept." The vision faded and I found myself back on the forest path with my friends. They looked at me with concern, clearly aware that something had happened, even if they didn't know what. "Alex?" Sarah asked tentatively. "Are you okay? You went somewhere else for a moment." I nodded, still processing everything I had seen. "I'm okay," I assured them. I understand now what this forest really is, why it's so important." As I began to explain, I could see the awe and understanding dawning on their faces. We had entered this forest as naive researchers, but we were leaving as guardians of something far greater than we had ever imagined. The path ahead of us was clear now, leading out of the forest. But I knew that our journey was far from over. We had been changed, marked by our experiences here. And someday, when the forest needed us, we would return. As we took our first steps towards the world beyond the trees, I felt a profound sense of purpose settle over me. The forest had tested us, pushed us to our limits, and in doing so, had revealed our true strength. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew we would face them together, bound by the trials we had overcome and the incredible secret we now shared. The Siuslaw forest had become a part of us, and we a part of it. And as we emerged into the sunlight, leaving the shadowy depths behind, I couldn't help but feel that our greatest adventure was just beginning. The cosmic vision of the forest's true nature faded, but the weight of the knowledge it imparted settled heavily upon me. As reality reasserted itself, I found myself back on the forest path with my friends, their concerned faces coming into focus. "Alex?" Professor Hartley's voice seemed to come from a great distance. "What happened? You looked elsewhere for a moment." I blinked, trying to organize the flood of information coursing through my mind. I saw the truth," I managed to say, my voice hoarse. "The forest, it's not just trees. It's alive, sentient, and it's protecting something ancient and powerful." Sarah's eyes widened. "What do you mean, protecting something?" Before I could answer, the air around us shimmered, and we were enveloped in a cocoon of light. When it cleared, we found ourselves in a vast, ethereal space. The cosmic tree I had seen in my vision towered before us, its branches stretching into infinity. "Whoa," Jake breathed, his usual bravado completely gone. A voice, neither male nor female, young nor old, resonated around us. "You have proven yourselves worthy of the truth," it said. "Now you must understand the gravity of what your presence has set in motion." The space around us shifted, and suddenly we were watching scenes play out like a cosmic movie. We saw the forest as it was eons ago, a nexus of magical energy, guarded by ancient druids. "Long ago," the voice continued, "this forest was the center of a great magical confluence. The druids who tended it used its power to maintain balance in the world. But there were those who sought to use the power for their own ends. The scene changed, showing a great battle. Dark forces clashed with the druids, the forest itself seeming to come alive to defend its guardians. The evil was defeated, but at a great cost. The druids used the last of their power to seal it away, deep within the heart of the forest. They knew that one day it might awaken again, so they imbued the forest itself with consciousness, tasking it with guarding against that day. I felt a chill run down my spine as I began to understand. And our presence, it's awakened this evil? The voice was grave. Your arrival, your exploration, your rituals. They have stirred something that has slumbered for millennia. The trials you faced were not merely to appease the forest, but to prepare you for what comes next. Suddenly, we were plunged into a series of rapid-fire visions. We saw cities crumbling, the sky darkening, the very fabric of reality tearing apart. If the evil fully awakens and escapes the forest, the voice warned, this is the future that awaits the world. The visions were overwhelming. Sarah stumbled, and Jake caught her, his face pale. Professor Hartley looked like he had aged years in moments. But why us? I asked, my voice shaking. We're not prepared for this. The scene shifted again, and we saw ourselves as we entered the forest, days ago. But now, I could see faint auras surrounding each of us, pulsing with potential. You were chosen, the voice explained. Each of you possesses a latent ability, a connection to the old magic that once flowed freely in the world. Your trials have awakened these abilities. You are the last line of defense against the darkness. As if on cue, I felt something stir within me. A warmth spread through my body, and I knew, without understanding how, that I could now sense the life force of the forest around me. I looked at my friends and saw the same realization dawning on their faces. Sarah's hands were glowing faintly. Jake stood straighter, an aura of strength surrounding him, and Professor Hartley's eyes shone with newfound clarity. What's happening to us? Sarah asked, staring at her glowing hands. You are becoming what you were always meant to be, the voice answered. Guardians of the balance. The cosmic tree before us shuddered, its leaves rustling with an unseen wind. But time grows short, the voice warned. The evil stirs. You must return and face it before it's too late. How? Jake demanded. We don't know the first thing about fighting ancient evil. Trust in yourselves and in each other, the voice replied. The forest will guide you, but be warned. The enemy will try to deceive you to turn you against one another. Stay united or all will be lost. The ethereal space around us began to fade. Wait, I called out. There's so much more we need to know. But the voice was already growing distant. Trust in the forest. Trust in yourselves. The fate of the world rests in your hands. With a jolt, we found ourselves back on the forest path. But everything looked different now. The trees seemed to pulse with an inner light, and I could feel the life force of every plant and creature around us. Did that really just happen? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Professor Hartley nodded slowly. I believe it did. And if what we saw is true, we don't have much time. I closed my eyes, reaching out with my newfound senses. And there, deep in the forest, I felt it. A cold, malevolent presence, slowly stirring to life. It's real, I said, opening my eyes. The evil, it's awake, and it's growing stronger by the minute. Jake clenched his fists, which were now glowing with a faint golden light. So what's the plan? How do we fight something like this? I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. We need to get back to the heart of the forest. That's where it's strongest, but it's also where we'll have the best chance of sealing it away again. But we don't know how to do that, Sarah protested. We're not druids or magicians. We're just us. I looked at each of my friends in turn, seeing the fear in their eyes, but also the determination. We're more than just us now, I said. We've been chosen for this. We've been given these powers for a reason. We have to try. Professor Hartley nodded. Alex is right. We made a pledge to protect this forest and, by extension, the world. We can't back down now. As we stood there, on the precipice of a battle we barely understood, I felt a mix of terror and exhilaration. We were about to face an evil older than civilization itself, armed with nothing but our newfound abilities and our trust in each other. "All right," Jake said, a hint of his old confidence returning. "Let's go save the world." We set off down the path, heading back into the depths of the forest. The trees seemed to part before us, guiding our way. As we walked, I could feel the malevolent presence growing stronger, a cold knot of dread forming in my stomach. But I also felt something else, the warmth of the forest's life force, the strength of my friends beside me, and a growing sense of purpose. Whatever we were about to face, we would face it together. As we delved deeper into the forest, the air grew thick with tension. The wildlife had gone silent, as if holding its breath in anticipation of the coming conflict. The very ground beneath our feet seemed to tremble with suppressed energy. "Stay close," I warned my friends. "And whatever happens, don't let it separate us. Our strength is in our unity." We pressed on, each step bringing us closer to the heart of the forest, and to the ancient evil that awaited us there. The fate of the world hung in the balance, and we were the only ones who could tip the scales. As we approached a clearing ahead, I sensed a surge of malevolent energy. This was it. The final confrontation was at hand. I looked at my friends, saw the determination in their eyes, and knew that whatever came next, we were ready to face it together. "Here we go," I said, stepping into the clearing. "It's time to fulfill our pledge to the forest." And with that, we strode forward to meet our destiny, the fate of the world resting squarely on our shoulders. The clearing ahead pulsed with an otherworldly energy, the air thick with tension. As we stepped through the last line of trees, the sight before us made my blood run cold. My friends, Sarah, Jake, and Professor Hartley, stood in a semicircle around a pulsating dark mass. Their eyes were glazed over, unseeing, as they chanted in a language I didn't recognize. "No!" I cried out, realizing with horror that they had fallen under the influence of the ancient evil. "Stop! This isn't right." But my words fell on deaf ears. They continued their eerie chant, their voices growing louder with each passing second. The dark mass at the center of their circle writhed and expanded, tendrils of inky blackness reaching out towards them. I tried to rush forward, but an invisible force held me back. The forest itself seemed to be working against me, roots rising from the ground to trip me, branches swinging down to block my path. "Please," I shouted, struggling against the forest's defenses. "You have to listen to me. This isn't what we're meant to do." Sarah's head twitched slightly at the sound of my voice, but her eyes remained unfocused. Jake and the professor showed no reaction at all. Whatever trance they were in, it was powerful. I closed my eyes, reaching out with my newfound senses, trying to connect with the true spirit of the forest. "I know you're trying to protect them," I said, my voice softer now. "But this isn't the way. That thing, it's deceiving them. Please, let me through. Let me save my friends." For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, I felt the resistance lessen. The roots sank back into the earth. The branches retreated. The forest was giving me a chance. I sprinted forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The dark mass pulsed angrily as I approached, sending out waves of cold that chilled me to my core. But I pushed through, focusing on my friends. "Sarah, Jake, Professor," I called out, reaching for them. "Listen to me. This isn't real. You're being controlled." I grabbed Sarah's arm and a jolt of energy passed between us. Her eyes cleared for a moment, confusion replacing the blank stare. "Alex?" she murmured. "What's happening?" "Fight it, Sarah," I urged her. "Remember who you are. Remember what we learned, what we promised to protect." The dark mass let out an unearthly shriek, and Sarah's eyes began to glaze over again. But I held on, pouring all of my will into breaking through to her. "Think about the forest, Sarah, the real forest, not this twisted version. Remember the beauty we saw, the life we felt." Slowly, painfully, awareness returned to her eyes. She gasped, stumbling back from the dark mass. "Oh God," she whispered. "What have we done?" "It's not your fault," I assured her. "Help me with the others." Together, we turned to Jake and Professor Hartley. The dark mass was growing more agitated, its shrieking rising to a fever pitch. Tendrils of darkness lashed out at us, but the forest, the real forest, rose up in our defense, branches and vines deflecting the attacks. "Jake!" Sarah called out, grasping his hand. "Come back to us. This isn't you. You're stronger than this." I focused on Professor Hartley, placing my hands on his shoulders. "Professor, think. Use that brilliant mind of yours. You know this isn't right. Break through." It took all of our combined efforts, but finally, Jake and the professor snapped out of their trances. As they came to, the dark mass howled in fury, expanding rapidly. "What's happening?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse. "The last thing I remember is feeling this pull, and then everything went dark." "It was trying to use us," Professor Hartley said, his face pale, "to complete some kind of ritual. If you hadn't stopped us, Alex—" "There's no time for that now," I interrupted. "Look." The dark mass was taking shape, forming into a towering, monstrous figure. Its body was composed of swirling shadows, its eyes glowing with malevolent red light. "Fools!" it roared, its voice shaking the very ground. "You cannot stop what has already begun. This world will be mine." Fear threatened to overwhelm me, but I stood my ground. "No," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "This isn't your world to take. We won't let you." The creature laughed, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "And how do you propose to stop me, little humans? You know not the power you face." I looked at my friends, saw the determination in their eyes despite their fear, and knew what we had to do. "Together," I said. "We stop you together." I reached out, grasping Sarah's hand. She took Jake's, who linked with Professor Hartley, who completed our circle by taking my other hand. As we connected, I felt a surge of energy flow through us. "Remember what we learned," I said to my friends. "Remember the true nature of the forest. It's not just trees and earth. It's a guardian, a protector of balance, and now so are we." As one, we began to chant, not the dark, twisted words the evil had fed us, but something purer, more ancient. The words came to us instinctively, rising from some deep collective memory. The monster roared in defiance, lashing out with tendrils of darkness. But where before they had nearly overwhelmed us, now they shattered against an invisible barrier. The forest was with us, lending its strength to our ritual. "You cannot win," the creature howled. "I am eternal. I am darkness itself." But its voice was growing weaker, its form less substantial. Our chant grew louder, and I could feel the power building around us. The trees swayed in a wind we couldn't feel, their leaves glowing with an inner light. "No!" the monster shrieked. "I will not be banished again!" With one final desperate surge, it lunged at us. But at that moment, we released the energy we had been building. A wave of pure white light exploded from our circle, engulfing the dark creature. It let out one last terrible scream as the light tore it apart, scattering its essence to the winds. The force of the blast knocked us off our feet, breaking our circle. For a long moment, we lay there, gasping for breath. Then slowly, we began to pick ourselves up. The clearing was quiet now, the oppressive atmosphere gone. The first rays of dawn were breaking through the trees, bathing everything in a soft, golden light. Is it over?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Professor Hartley nodded slowly. "I believe so. We've done what the ancient druids did, sealed the evil away once more." Jake let out a shaky laugh. "Just another day in the Cieslaw forest, right?" Despite everything, I found myself smiling. Something tells me this wasn't a typical day, even for this place. As we stood there, marveling at what we had accomplished, the forest around us began to shift. The trees parted, revealing a clear path leading out of the woods. "I think," I said softly, "the forest is telling us it's time to go." We gathered our belongings in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. As we prepared to leave, I turned back to look at the clearing one last time. For a moment, I thought I saw the shimmering outline of the cosmic tree, its branches stretching up into infinity. "Thank you," I whispered. "We won't forget." As we walked down the path, I could feel the forest's presence slowly fading. But something remained. A connection, a spark of the power we had wielded. We were changed, marked by our experience in ways we were only beginning to understand. The sun was fully up by the time we reached the edge of the forest. We paused there, on the threshold between two worlds. "So," Jake said, breaking the silence, "what now?" I looked at my friends, saw the same mix of exhaustion, wonder, and determination that I felt. "Now," I said, "we keep our promise. We protect the secret of this place and we stay ready, because something tells me our job isn't over yet." Sarah nodded. "The forest chose us for a reason. This is just the beginning." Professor Hartley smiled, a glint of excitement in his eyes. "There's so much more to learn, to understand, but we'll do it together." With one last look at the mystical forest behind us, we stepped out into the mundane world. But we carried a piece of the extraordinary with us, in our memories, in our newfound abilities, and in the unbreakable bond we now shared. The Siuslaw Forest had changed us, challenged us, and ultimately made us into something more than we were. As we walked towards our future, I couldn't help but feel that our greatest adventures were still to come. The end, or perhaps just the beginning. The sun was dipping low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink as I trudged along the worn hiking trail. The Green Mountain National Forest stretched out around me, a sea of emerald, punctuated by the occasional flash of autumn colors. I'd been walking for hours, my backpack heavy with camping gear and my trusty Nikon. As a freelance photographer, I often found myself in these woods, searching for that perfect shot. Today, though, something felt different. The air was thick with an anticipation I couldn't quite explain, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I paused to take a swig from my water bottle, wiping the sweat from my brow. That's when I saw it. A glint of something metallic just off the trail, partially hidden beneath a carpet of fallen leaves. Curiosity piqued. I stepped off the path, my boots crunching softly on the forest floor. As I approached, the object began to take shape. It was a camera, and not just any camera. This was vintage, probably from the 1950s or earlier. "Well, hello there," I murmured, crouching down to get a better look. "What's your story?" The camera was a beauty, its black leather body weathered but still intact. The brass fittings had developed a rich patina, speaking to years of use and exposure to the elements. But what struck me most was how out of place it seemed. This wasn't the kind of thing you'd take on a casual hike. I picked it up, surprised by its weight. It felt solid, substantial in a way modern cameras never do. As I turned it over in my hands, a chill ran down my spine. There was film inside. "No way," I breathed, my heart rate quickening. "Please tell me you're still good." I knew the chances of the film being usable after who knows how long out here were slim to none, but I couldn't help the excitement bubbling up inside me. This was the kind of find that could make a photographer's career, or at least make for one hell of a story. I carefully placed the camera in my backpack, making a mental note to handle it gently on the hike back. The sun had nearly set now, long shadows stretching across the forest floor. I needed to make camp soon. As I set up my tent in a small clearing, my mind kept wandering back to the camera. Who did it belong to? How long had it been out there? And most intriguingly, what images might be captured on that film? Sleep didn't come easily that night. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, seemed somehow more ominous. I tossed and turned, my dreams filled with shadowy figures and the click of a camera shutter. When dawn broke, I was already up and packing. The anticipation of developing that film had me jittery, eager to get back to my cabin and the makeshift darkroom I'd set up there. The hike back seemed to take forever, each step both bringing me closer to answers and filling me with an inexplicable dread. By the time I reached my cabin, the sun was high in the sky and I was drenched in sweat. I burst through the door, dropping my backpack unceremoniously on the floor. With trembling hands, I extracted the camera, placing it reverently on my workbench. "Okay, old-timer," I said, addressing the camera as if it could hear me. "Let's see what secrets you're hiding." I'd developed film before, of course, but never anything this old. I worked slowly, methodically, terrified of making a mistake that could destroy whatever images the camera held. As I hung up the negatives to dry, I tried to temper my expectations. "They're probably all ruined," I muttered to myself. "Water damage, light leaks. Hell, maybe the camera was empty all along." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. There was something about this camera, something that told me its contents were going to change everything. The wait for the negatives to dry was excruciating. I paced my small cabin, alternating between bouts of manic energy and moments of paralyzing fear. What if the photos were amazing? What if they were terrible? What if they were something else entirely? Finally, it was time. I entered my darkroom, the red safe light casting an eerie glow over everything. With a deep breath, I began the process of creating prints from the negatives. As the first image began to appear in the developer tray, I leaned in close, eager to see what would emerge. At first, it was just shapes, indistinct and blurry. But as the image clarified, my excitement turned to confusion, then to horror. It was a person. That much was clear. But they weren't posing or smiling. The figure in the photo was sprawled at an unnatural angle at the bottom of what looked like a ravine. Their eyes were open, staring blankly at the camera, and there was no mistaking the pallor of death on their features. "What the hell?" I whispered, my voice sounding strange and hollow in the small room. I quickly moved on to the next print, hoping it would provide some context, some explanation. But the second photo was just as disturbing. Another body, this one tangled in the branches of a fallen tree. My hands were shaking as I worked through the rest of the photos. Each one revealed another gruesome scene of death in the forest. Some seemed recent, others showed signs of decay that suggested they'd been there for quite some time. As I hung up the last print, my mind was reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of sick joke, or maybe an art project gone wrong. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. These photos had an authenticity to them that couldn't be faked. I stumbled out of the darkroom, gasping for air. The cabin suddenly felt too small, too confining. I threw open the front door, gulping in the cool forest air. That's when I saw him, a figure standing at the edge of the trees watching me. He was old, his face weathered like the bark of the ancient pines surrounding him, and in his hands he held a camera identical to the one I'd found. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I knew my life would never be the same. The old man's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome to the club, son," he called out, his voice carrying on the wind. "Hope you're ready for what comes next." Before I could respond, he raised the camera to his eye. There was a flash, the sound of a shutter clicking, and then darkness. I stumbled back into my cabin, my mind reeling from the encounter with the old man. The flash of his camera still burned behind my eyelids, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in my world. With trembling hands, I reached for the stack of photos I'd developed earlier. I needed to look at them again, to convince myself that what I'd seen was real. The first photo stared up at me accusingly. A young woman, her body broken at the bottom of a ravine I recognized all too well. I'd hiked past that spot dozens of times, never knowing the grim secret it held. "This can't be happening," I muttered, my voice sounding hollow in the quiet cabin. I flipped to the next photo and the next, each one revealing another gruesome scene of death in the forest. A hiker trapped under a fallen tree. A climber's body splayed on jagged rocks. A camper pale and still in a tent. My hands shook as I recognized more locations. The old fire tower, the hidden waterfall, the rocky outcropping that offered the best views of the valley. Places I'd visited countless times, now forever tainted by these images of death. How? I whispered, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. How is this possible? That's when I noticed something I'd missed before in my initial shock. There were dates scrawled on the back of each photo. Some were recent, disturbingly so. Others dated back decades, long before I'd ever set foot in these woods. I grabbed my laptop, my fingers flying over the keyboard as I searched for any news reports that might corroborate what I was seeing. It didn't take long to find something. Local hiker found dead in Green Mountain National Forest. The headline blared. The article, dated just 2 weeks ago, described how a young woman had been discovered at the bottom of a ravine, believed to have fallen while hiking alone. My stomach churned as I compared the article to the first photo. The description matched perfectly. The location, the victim, even the clothes she was wearing. "This is real," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "It's all real." I pushed away from the computer, pacing the small confines of my cabin. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The camera, the old man, the photos. How were they all connected? A thought struck me then, so obvious I couldn't believe it hadn't occurred to me sooner. I still had the camera. I could take a photo, see for myself if it truly had some supernatural power. "This is crazy," I told myself as I retrieved the vintage camera from my bag, completely insane. And yet, I couldn't stop myself. I raised the camera, pointing it at myself. My finger hesitated over the shutter button for just a moment before I pressed down. The click of the shutter seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet cabin. I lowered the camera, my heart pounding. Now what? I asked the empty room. I knew I should develop the photo right away, but fear held me back. What if it showed me dead, like all the others? What if by taking that photo I'd somehow sealed my own fate? Hours passed as I sat there, the camera a silent accusation on the table in front of me. As the sky outside darkened, I finally found the courage to move. The dark room felt different this time, oppressive, threatening. The red safe light cast sinister shadows as I went through the motions of developing the film. As the image began to appear in the developer tray, I held my breath. At first it was just shapes, indistinct and blurry. But as the image clarified, my worst fears were realized. It was me, but not as I was now. The figure in the photo was clearly dead, eyes staring blankly at nothing, body awkwardly splayed on forest ground. "No," I breathed, stumbling back from the tray. "No, no, no." I fled the dark room, gasping for air. The walls of the cabin seemed to close in around me. I needed to get out, to run, to escape this nightmare. But as I burst out of the cabin, I found myself face to face with the old man again. He stood there, calm as could be, that ancient camera hanging around his neck. "Figured it out yet, son?" he asked, his voice gravelly with age. "Who are you?" I demanded. "What's happening to me?" The old man sighed, suddenly looking every one of his many years. "Name's Clarence, and what's happening to you? Well, that's a long story. But the short version is, you've been chosen, just like I was all those years ago." "Chosen? For what?" Clarence gestured to the camera around my neck. I hadn't even realized I'd brought it out with me. "To be the keeper, to document the forest's harvest." I shook my head, unwilling to accept what he was saying. "This is insane. Those people in the photos, did you kill them?" "Me?" Clarence let out a harsh laugh. "No, boy, the forest did that. It's always hungry, you see. Been that way long before you or I came along." "The forest can't kill people," I argued, even as a part of me remembered all the times I'd felt watched while hiking, all the stories of people who went into these woods and never came out. "Can it?" Clarence raised an eyebrow. "Then how do you explain those photos of yours? Or this?" He raised his own camera, and before I could react, he'd snapped a photo. The flash momentarily blinded me, and when my vision cleared, Clarence was holding out a Polaroid. With trembling hands, I took it. As the image developed, I felt the blood drain from my face. It showed me, just as I was standing now, but superimposed over my living form was a ghostly image of my dead self, the same one from the photo I'd just developed. What does this mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Clarence's expression softened slightly. It means you've got a choice to make, son. You can run from this, try to escape your fate. But trust me, I tried that once. It doesn't end well. Or you can accept it, become the new keeper, take up the mantle and do what needs to be done. I stared at him, horror and disbelief warring within me. And if I refuse? Clarence shrugged. Then the forest will take you just like all the others, and someone else will find that camera, and the cycle will begin again. He turned to go, pausing at the edge of the trees. You've got 1 week, according to that photo of yours. Better make your decision quick. And with that he was gone, swallowed up by the darkness of the forest. I stood there for a long time, the damning Polaroid in one hand, the vintage camera in the other. The weight of the choice before me felt impossibly heavy. As I finally turned to go back inside, a cool wind whispered through the trees. For a moment, I could have sworn I heard voices on that wind, the voices of all those lost souls in the photos. 1 week. I had 1 week to decide my fate, to choose between becoming a harbinger of death or becoming its victim. I looked out at the dark forest, suddenly alien and menacing. What am I going to do? I asked the night. But the only answer was the rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl, sounds that now seemed more like a warning than the comforting noises of nature I'd always known. With a shudder, I retreated into my cabin, locking the door behind me. But as I lay in bed that night, sleep eluding me, I couldn't shake the feeling that no lock could keep out the choice that was coming for me. The forest was waiting. The dark room felt like a tomb as I stood there, watching the image slowly materialize in the developing tray. My hands trembled and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. As the photo became clearer, I felt the air leave my lungs in a rush. There I was, sprawled on the forest floor, my eyes wide and lifeless. The scene was horrifyingly detailed. I could make out every leaf, every shadow, every bruise on my pale skin. It was as if I was looking at a window into the future, a future where I no longer existed. This can't be real, I whispered, my voice sounding hollow in the small room. But I knew it was. I'd seen too much in the past few days to deny the truth any longer. I lifted the photo with shaking hands, bringing it closer to the red safe light for a better look. My photographer's eye kicked in, analyzing every detail despite the revulsion churning in my gut. The location was familiar, a clearing not far from my cabin, one I passed through almost daily on my hikes. My body lay crumpled at the base of a large oak tree, limbs bent at unnatural angles. There was a camera, the cursed vintage one, lying just out of reach of my outstretched hand. As I scrutinized the image, searching desperately for any clue that might help me prevent this grim future, my eyes caught on something in the corner of the frame. A shadow, oddly shaped and somehow darker than the surrounding forest gloom. Was it just a trick of the light, or something more sinister? I flipped the photo over and my blood ran cold. There, scrawled in the same handwriting I'd seen on the other photos, was a date. 1 week from today. No, I breathed, stumbling back until I hit the wall. No, this can't be happening. But it was. In 7 days, according to this supernatural premonition, I would die. I burst out of the dark room, gasping for air. The walls of my small cabin suddenly felt suffocating. I needed to get out, to think, to find a way to change this horrifying fate. As I stumbled onto my porch, the cool night air hit me like a slap. The forest loomed dark and menacing, no longer the peaceful sanctuary I'd always known it to be. Now it felt alive, watching, waiting to claim me. What am I supposed to do? I shouted into the darkness, my voice cracking with fear and frustration. Only the whisper of wind through the leaves answered me, a sound that now seemed more like mocking laughter than the soothing rustle I once loved. I sank down onto the porch steps, burying my face in my hands. My mind raced, trying to make sense of everything that had happened since I found that damned camera. The old man's words echoed in my head. You've got a choice to make, son. You can run from this, try to escape your fate, but trust me, I tried that once. It doesn't end well. But how could I accept this? How could I just sit back and wait for death to come for me? I lifted my head, my gaze falling on the vintage camera sitting innocently on the porch railing where I'd left it earlier. A surge of anger rose in me, and before I knew what I was doing, I was on my feet grabbing the camera. This is all your fault, I snarled, raising it above my head, ready to smash it against the porch boards. But something stopped me. A feeling, an instinct, a morbid curiosity, perhaps. What if destroying the camera made things worse? What if it sealed my fate instead of changing it? Slowly, I lowered the camera, turning it over in my hands. Despite everything, I couldn't help but admire its craftsmanship, the weight of history it carried. What are you? I murmured, tracing the intricate engravings on its body. And why me? As if in response, a cool breeze swept across the porch, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. I shuddered, quickly setting the camera back down. I spent the rest of the night pacing, alternating between bouts of frantic planning and moments of paralyzing fear. I considered running, leaving the forest and never looking back. But something told me it wouldn't be that easy. The old man had said he'd tried to escape once, and it hadn't ended well. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I finally collapsed onto my bed, exhaustion overtaking me. But sleep, when it came, brought no relief. My dreams were a chaotic swirl of images. The people from the photos, their dead eyes accusing me of failing them somehow. The old man, Clarence, standing at the edge of the forest, beckoning me deeper into the shadows. And always, always, the vision of my own death, playing out in vivid detail. I jolted awake with a gasp, drenched in sweat and tangled in my sheets. The sun was high in the sky. I'd slept most of the day away. As I stumbled to the bathroom to splash water on my face, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. I looked haggard, wild-eyed, like a man on the edge of sanity, which I supposed I was. Pull yourself together, I told my reflection sternly. You've got 6 days to figure this out. 6 days to change your fate. But even as I said it, doubt gnawed at me. How does one outsmart death? How does one fight against a force as ancient and implacable as this forest seemed to be? I spent the rest of the day researching, scouring the internet for any information on supernatural cameras, forest spirits, anything that might give me a clue on how to proceed. But every lead I found seemed more far-fetched than the last. As night fell once again, I found myself back on the porch staring out into the darkness. The forest seemed to press closer, its shadows deeper, more menacing. I'm not going to let you take me, I said, my voice sounding small in the vast silence. Do you hear me? I'm going to fight this. A branch snapped in the distance, making me jump. For a moment, I thought I saw movement at the tree line, a flicker of something pale, like the flutter of a coat or a dress. But when I blinked, it was gone. I retreated back into the cabin, double-checking the locks on the doors and windows. Not that they'd do much good against whatever force was at work here, but it made me feel a little better. As I lay in bed that night, sleep once again eluding me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important, some vital clue that would unravel this whole mystery. I thought about the old man, Clarence. He'd survived, hadn't he? He'd found a way to coexist with whatever dark power ruled these woods. Maybe, just maybe, that was the key. I'll find you tomorrow, I promised the darkness. I'll make you tell me how to survive this. But as I finally drifted off into a fitful sleep, the wind outside seemed to whisper a response. Time is running out. And in my dreams, I died again and again, each time waking just before the moment of impact. The date of my impending doom seared into my mind like a brand. 6 days left. 6 days to change my fate. 6 days to solve the mystery of the forest and its hungry, ancient power. The race against time had begun. The morning light filtered through the cabin windows, finding me hunched over my laptop, eyes bloodshot from a night of frantic research. Empty coffee mugs littered the table, testament to my desperate quest for answers. Come on, I muttered, scrolling through yet another obscure forum thread about haunted objects. There has to be something about this camera. My search had begun with the camera's make and model, tracing its history back to the 1930s. It was a rare piece, handcrafted by a small company that had gone out of business decades ago. But that was where the normal part of its history ended. As I dug deeper, I uncovered a trail of previous owners. Each story I found ended the same way: mysterious deaths or disappearances. The camera seemed to leave a wake of tragedy wherever it went. Jesus, I breathed, pushing away from the computer and rubbing my tired eyes. What have I gotten myself into? I glanced at the vintage camera sitting innocuously on the coffee table. In the morning light, it looked almost beautiful, its brass fittings gleaming. It was hard to believe something so ordinary could be so deadly. Sighing, I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. That's when I noticed something odd, a slight unevenness in the leather covering on the bottom. Frowning, I ran my fingers over the spot. There was definitely something there, a slight bulge that shouldn't exist. Heart racing, I carefully began to peel back the leather. It came away easily, as if it had been removed and replaced before. Underneath, I found a small compartment cleverly built into the camera's body. "What the hell?" I whispered, carefully extracting a folded piece of paper from the hidden space. With trembling hands, I unfolded the note. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. It read, "To the one who holds this camera, beware its power and its curse. What it shows, it brings to pass. Seek the keeper of old words, where pages whisper secrets dark. The truth lies hidden in plain sight. But time is short. The price is high." I read the note several times, my mind racing. The keeper of old words, I mused aloud. Where pages whisper secrets, a library or a bookstore? Suddenly I remembered something. An old bookshop I'd passed on my drives into town. It had always caught my eye, with its quaint, almost out-of-time appearance. Worth a shot, I decided, grabbing my keys. I hesitated for a moment, then picked up the camera too. Something told me I might need it. The drive into town felt longer than usual, the forest pressing close on either side of the road. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes following my every move. The bookshop, when I finally reached it, looked even more antiquated up close. Faded gold lettering on the window read, "Blackwood's Rare Books Curiosities." The door creaked ominously as I pushed it open. The interior was dim and dusty, packed floor to ceiling with books. The smell of old paper and leather filled the air. For a moment I just stood there, letting my eyes adjust to the gloom. "Can I help you?" I jumped at the voice, spinning around to find an old woman peering at me from behind a cluttered counter. She was tiny, wrinkled like a dried apple, with sharp eyes that seemed to look right through me. I'm looking for information," I stammered, suddenly unsure how to explain my bizarre situation. The old woman's eyes narrowed. "Information about what exactly?" I hesitated, then decided to take a risk. I pulled out the camera, setting it on the counter between us. "About this." The change in the old woman was immediate and startling. She recoiled from the camera as if it were a venomous snake, her face paling. "Where did you get that?" she hissed, her voice trembling. "I found it in the forest," I explained quickly. "Please, I need to know what it is, how it works. I think it's going to kill me." The old woman stared at me for a long moment, then sighed heavily. "I knew this day would come," she murmured, more to herself than to me. "Follow me." She led me to a back room, even more crowded with books than the main shop. Muttering to herself, she pulled a thick, leather-bound volume from a high shelf. "This is a dangerous thing you've stumbled into, young man," she said, placing the book on a rickety table. "That camera has a long and bloody history." "I know," I said. "I've been researching it, but I need to know more. How does it work? Can its predictions be changed?" The old woman's expression grew grave. "You misunderstand. The camera doesn't predict death. It causes it." Her words hit me like a physical blow. I staggered back, my mind reeling. What do you mean?" "The camera is a conduit," she explained, her voice low and urgent. "A tool used by something ancient and hungry that lives in those woods. When it takes a picture, it doesn't just capture an image. It captures a soul, marking it for harvest." I felt sick, remembering all the photos I'd developed. All those people, dead because of this camera, because of me. "But I didn't take those other pictures," I protested weakly. "I just found the camera." The old woman shook her head. "It doesn't matter. By taking possession of the camera, you've become its new agent, and now it's chosen you as its next victim." "There has to be a way to stop it," I insisted, desperation creeping into my voice. "To break the curse or destroy the camera or something." "Many have tried," she said softly. "Few have succeeded. And those who did, well, the price was always high." She turned to the book, flipping through its pages with practiced ease. "Here," she said, pointing to an illustration that made my blood run cold. It showed a figure much like the one I'd seen in the forest, tall, gaunt, with antlers sprouting from its head. "The spirit of the forest," the old woman explained. "Some call it the Wendigo, others the Dark Hunter. It's as old as the woods themselves, always hungry, always hunting." "And the camera?" "A tool it uses to mark its prey, to ensure a steady supply of souls to feed on." I felt overwhelmed, drowning in the horror of it all. "What can I do?" I asked, hating how small and scared my voice sounded. The old woman regarded me with a mixture of pity and resignation. "You have two choices," she said. "You can try to run, to hide, but the hunter will find you eventually. It always does. Or," I prompted when she paused, "or you can face it, confront the spirit in its own domain, but be warned. No one who has attempted this has ever returned." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "And if I do neither? If I just wait?" Her eyes softened with sympathy. "Then in 6 days, the picture you took will come true, and your soul will belong to the forest." I left the bookshop in a daze, the weight of the camera in my bag feeling like a ticking bomb. The old woman's final words echoed in my head. "Whatever you choose, choose quickly. Time is not on your side." As I drove back to my cabin, the forest seemed to press closer than ever, its shadows deeper, its presence more menacing. I knew now what lurked in those woods, and the knowledge was almost worse than the ignorance had been. I had a choice to make: run and hide, buying myself time but living in constant fear, confront the spirit on its own turf, facing near certain death, or do nothing and let fate take its course. As the cabin came into view, I made my decision. I wouldn't run, and I wouldn't wait for death to come to me. I would face this thing, this Wendigo or Dark Hunter or whatever it was. I pulled up to the cabin, my resolve hardening. I had 5 days left, 5 days to prepare for the fight of my life, and quite possibly, for my death. The hunt was on. But this time, I wouldn't be the prey. I would be the hunter. The sun had barely crested the horizon when I burst out of my cabin, determination etched on my face. I had a plan, a desperate, probably foolish plan, but it was all I had. "You're not getting me," I muttered, glaring at the surrounding forest. "Not today, not ever." My strategy was simple: avoid the clearing where my death photo was taken at all costs. I'd spend the day as far from that spot as possible, hoping that by changing my routine, I could change my fate. I threw my backpack into my truck and peeled out of the driveway, gravel spitting from beneath the tires. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking presence. Every rustle of leaves felt like a whispered threat. My destination was a small town about an hour away. I figured putting some distance between myself and the forest couldn't hurt. As I drove, I tried to calm my racing thoughts. "You're going to be fine," I told myself. "Just stay away from the clearing, break the pattern, you can beat this." But even as I spoke the words, doubt gnawed at me. The old woman's voice echoed in my head. "The camera doesn't predict death, it causes it." I shook off the thought as I pulled into the parking lot of a small diner. I needed coffee, food, and a semblance of normalcy. The cheery ding of the bell as I entered the diner felt jarringly out of place with my current state of mind. I slid into a booth, ordering coffee from a smiling waitress who seemed oblivious to my inner turmoil. As I waited for my order, I pulled out my phone. I needed to talk to someone, to share the burden of this impossible situation. My finger hovered over my best friend Mike's number before I hit call. The phone rang several times before a groggy voice answered. "Hello? Mike, it's me. I need to talk to you. It's important." There must have been something in my voice because Mike's tone immediately sharpened. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" I took a deep breath, then launched into my story. I told him everything, finding the camera, the death photos, my own impending doom. As I spoke, I could hear how crazy it all sounded. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Mike spoke, his voice cautious. "Look, man, I know you've been under a lot of stress lately with your photography business and all. Maybe you should talk to someone, a professional, I mean." "You don't believe me," I said flatly. "It's not that I don't believe you're upset," Mike said carefully. "But what you're describing, it's not possible. Cursed cameras, forest spirits. Come on, you know how that sounds." I felt a wave of frustration and loneliness wash over me. "I know how it sounds, Mike, but I'm telling you it's real. I'm in danger." Okay, Mike said, clearly trying to placate me. "Why don't you come stay with me for a few days? Get out of those woods, clear your head a bit." I was about to agree when something caught my eye outside the diner window. A figure, tall and unnaturally thin, standing at the edge of the parking lot. For a split second, I saw antlers silhouetted against the sky. I blinked, and it was gone. I can't," I stammered into the phone. "It would follow me, put you in danger too." "What would follow you?" "Man, you're really starting to worry me." "I have to go," I said abruptly, ending the call despite Mike's protests. I threw some money on the table and rushed out of the diner, my coffee untouched. The parking lot was empty now, no sign of the figure I'd seen, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was stronger than ever. Back in my truck, I drove aimlessly, no destination in mind except away. The day passed in a blur of back roads and small towns, always with one eye on the rearview mirror, always expecting to see something terrible gaining on me. As the sun began to set, I realized I needed to head back. I couldn't stay away from the cabin forever, and I needed to regroup, to plan my next move. The drive back seemed to take forever, the forest growing denser and darker with each passing mile. I was about halfway home when it happened. A deafening crack split the air, and suddenly a massive tree branch was falling directly towards my windshield. I swerved instinctively, the truck fishtailing on the narrow road. For a heart-stopping moment, I was sure this was it. This was how the prophecy would be fulfilled. But somehow, miraculously, I regained control. The branch crashed harmlessly behind me, and I screeched to a stop, my heart pounding in my chest. I sat there for a long moment, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The near miss had shaken me to my core, making me realize just how fragile life truly was. "This is insane," I whispered to myself. "I can't keep running. I can't keep living like this." As the adrenaline faded, a new resolve took its place. I couldn't avoid my fate forever. Sooner or later, the forest, the camera, the spirit, whatever it was, would find me. My only chance was to face it head on. I started the truck again, this time with a clear destination in mind. I was going back to where it all began, the spot where I'd found the camera. The sun had set by the time I reached the trailhead. The forest loomed before me, a wall of darkness broken only by the beam of my flashlight. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run, to hide. But I pushed forward. The hike seemed longer than I remembered, each step taking me deeper into the heart of the forest. The usual nighttime sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals, were absent. The woods were eerily silent, as if holding their breath in anticipation. Finally, I reached the spot. It looked ordinary enough, just a small clearing off the main trail. But as I stood there, I could feel the wrongness of the place, a heaviness in the air that hadn't been there before. I took a deep breath, then spoke to the darkness. I know you're out there. I know what you are, what you've been doing, and I'm here to tell you, it stops now. I'm not going to be your victim. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then a whisper of wind through the trees that almost sounded like laughter. The shadows seemed to deepen, to move with a life of their own. And then I saw it. Emerging from between the trees, a figure both familiar and terrifyingly alien. Tall, impossibly thin, with antlers branching from its head like a crown of thorns. Its eyes glowed with an inner fire, fixed unblinkingly on me. Fear threatened to overwhelm me, but I stood my ground. I raised the camera, my weapon, my curse, and pointed it at the creature. "Let's end this," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. As my finger tensed on the shutter button, the world seemed to hold its breath. In that moment, I knew that whatever happened next would change everything. There would be no going back. The camera clicked, the sound impossibly loud in the silent forest. A flash illuminated the clearing, burning the image of the creature into my retinas. And then the real battle began. Chapter 5 ended with this confrontation, but the outcome, my fate, the fate of the forest, the truth behind the camera's power, all hung in the balance. As the flash faded and darkness rushed back in, I knew that the next few moments would determine everything. The race against time had led me here, to this moment, this choice. Now, all that remained was to see it through, whatever the cost. The flash from the camera faded, leaving me momentarily blind in the darkness of the forest. As my vision slowly returned, I realized with a start that the creature, the Wendigo, the Dark Hunter, whatever it was, had vanished. "Where are you? Where are—" I called out, my voice sounding small and insignificant in the vast silence of the woods. No answer came, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the night breeze. I knew I couldn't stay here. Standing still felt like painting a target on my back. With no clear direction in mind, I began to hike deeper into the forest, my flashlight beam cutting a feeble path through the darkness. As I walked, the feeling of being watched intensified. Eyes seemed to peer at me from every shadow, every dark hollow between the trees. More than once I spun around, certain I'd caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, only to find nothing there. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, trying to steady my nerves. You knew this wouldn't be easy. The words had barely left my mouth when I tripped over an exposed root, sending me sprawling to the forest floor. As I pushed myself up, spitting out leaves and dirt, my flashlight beam fell on something that made my heart skip a beat. There, half hidden by undergrowth, was a rough trail I'd never noticed before. It looked old, disused, but definitely man-made. Without really knowing why, I felt compelled to follow it. The trail wound through the trees, becoming steeper and more treacherous as it went. Just as I was beginning to think it led nowhere, the trees suddenly thinned, revealing a small clearing. And there, bathed in pale moonlight, stood an old abandoned cabin. "What the hell?" I breathed, taking in the dilapidated structure. It looked like it had been there for decades, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Yet something about it seemed eerily familiar, as if I'd seen it before. Cautiously, I approached the cabin. The porch steps creaked ominously under my weight, and for a moment I hesitated, wondering if the whole structure might collapse. But curiosity drove me forward. The door hung askew on its hinges, offering no resistance as I pushed it open. The interior was dark and musty, filled with the scent of decay and abandonment. My flashlight beam revealed a layer of dust covering everything, undisturbed for who knows how long. As I moved further into the cabin, something on the far wall caught my eye. I approached slowly, my breath catching in my throat as I realized what I was seeing. The entire wall was covered in photographs, dozens, maybe hundreds of them, all in the same style as the ones from the cursed camera. Each one showed a person, captured in the moment of their death. "Oh my God," I whispered, my free hand covering my mouth in horror. I recognized some of the locations from my own hikes through the forest. Others seemed to be from different parts of the country, even the world. But all shared the same haunting quality, the same sense of a life cut tragically short. As I examined the photos, my flashlight beam fell on something else. An old, leather-bound book sitting on a rickety table nearby. Dust plumed into the air as I carefully opened it, revealing pages filled with cramped, spidery handwriting. It was a journal. The first entry was dated 1932. "I've done it. After years of research, of delving into forbidden knowledge, I've created a device that can capture not just images but souls. The camera works better than I could have ever imagined. But the cost, oh, the cost is terrible." I flipped through the pages, my horror growing with each entry. The journal told the tale of the camera's creator, a man named Elias Blackwood. He'd been a respected photographer and scientist until the death of his wife and child in a tragic accident drove him to the brink of madness. Desperate to bring them back, he'd turned to dark magic and arcane science, eventually creating the camera as a way to capture and preserve souls. But the power had come with a price. One entry, dated several years later, read, "The forest spirit grows stronger with each soul the camera claims. I thought I could control it, use it to bring back my loved ones. But I was a fool. It hungers, always hungers, and now I fear I've unleashed something I cannot stop." The final entry was a desperate scrawl. "If anyone finds this, destroy the camera. It's the only way to end this nightmare. I go now to confront the spirit, to try and undo what I've done. May God have mercy on my soul." I closed the journal with shaking hands, my mind reeling from what I'd read. The pieces were falling into place, the camera, the spirit, the deaths. It was all connected, a web of dark magic and tragic consequences. A sudden noise from outside snapped me back to the present. Heart racing, I crept to the window, peering out into the moonlit clearing. For a moment I saw nothing. Then a figure darted between the trees at the edge of the clearing. It moved with unnatural speed and grace, there one moment and gone the next. "Blackwood," I called out, surprising myself. Part of me hoped irrationally that the camera's creator had somehow survived, that he might have answers. But the only response was a low, guttural growl that raised the hair on the back of my neck. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I had to get out of here, had to find a way to end this. But how? Blackwood's journal offered no solutions, only warnings and regrets. As I turned to leave, my eye caught on something I'd missed before. There, tucked behind the photos on the wall, was a map. I carefully extracted it, recognizing it as a detailed representation of the forest. Several locations were marked on the map, including the cabin I was in now. But one spot in particular drew my attention. A crudely drawn X deep in the heart of the forest, with the words, "The Hollow," scrawled beside it. Something told me this was important, maybe even the key to unraveling this whole mystery. I folded the map and tucked it into my pocket, along with Blackwood's journal. As I did, I heard another noise from outside. Closer this time, like something moving on the cabin's porch. Panic surged through me. I needed to leave now. But the only way out was through the front door, where the sound had come from. For a long moment, I stood frozen. indecision paralyzing me. Then, steeling myself, I gripped my flashlight like a weapon and lunged for the door. I burst out onto the porch, ready to confront whatever waited for me. But the clearing was empty, silent save for the pounding of my own heart. Yet as I scanned the tree line, I caught a glimpse of something. A pair of eyes, glowing an unnatural green in the darkness. They blinked once and then were gone. I didn't wait around to see if they'd return. I took off down the overgrown path, running as if the hounds of hell were at my heels. For all I knew, they were. As I ran, my mind churned with everything I'd learned. The camera's dark origins, the trapped souls, the hungry forest spirit. And now, a new destination, the Hollow. I didn't know what I'd find there, but I knew one thing for certain. The answers I sought lay deeper in the forest. To unravel this mystery, to save myself and maybe even break the curse, I'd have to venture into the very heart of darkness. The night pressed in around me as I ran, the shadows seeming to reach for me with grasping fingers. But I pushed on, driven by a desperate hope. Somewhere in this forest lay the truth, and I was going to find it no matter the cost. The forest was a blur around me as I ran, branches whipping at my face and roots threatening to trip me at every step. But I couldn't slow down. The flickering figure I'd glimpsed outside the cabin was always just ahead, always just out of reach. "Wait!" I shouted, my voice hoarse and breathless. "I need answers." The figure didn't slow, didn't even seem to acknowledge my presence. It moved with an unnatural grace, gliding over obstacles that left me stumbling and gasping for air. I don't know how long I chased it. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the depths of the forest. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but still I pushed on, driven by a desperate need for answers. Then, suddenly, the ground disappeared beneath my feet. I had just enough time to let out a startled yelp before I was tumbling head over heels down a steep, leaf-covered slope. Branches and rocks battered my body as I rolled, unable to stop my descent. With a final bone-jarring thud, I landed at the bottom of the hill. For a long moment I just lay there, dazed and gasping for breath. Every part of me hurt, and I could taste blood where I'd bitten my tongue. Slowly, groaning with the effort, I pushed myself up to a sitting position. As my vision cleared, I realized I was in a small clearing I'd never seen before. The trees here were older, their gnarled branches reaching towards a sky I could barely see through the dense canopy. "Well, well," a gravelly voice spoke from behind me. "You're a persistent one, aren't you?" I scrambled to my feet, spinning around to face the speaker. What I saw made me stumble back in shock. An old man stood there, but like no old man I'd ever seen. His form seemed to flicker and waver, as if he was only partially in this world. One moment he looked solid, the next I could almost see through him. What are you?" I managed to ask, my voice shaking. The old man's mouth twisted into a sad smile. "Don't you recognize me, boy? You've been reading my journal, after all." Realization hit me like a physical blow. "Elias Blackwood," I breathed. "But you died, decades ago." Blackwood nodded, his form flickering again. "Death, life, the boundaries blur in this place. I'm trapped here, you see, bound to the forest by my own cursed invention." I shook my head, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, what I was hearing. "The camera. You created it." "Indeed I did," Blackwood sighed. "In my grief, my arrogance, I thought I could master death itself. Instead, I became its servant." He began to pace, his feet making no sound on the forest floor. "The camera, you see, doesn't just capture images, it captures souls. Each photo taken is a life claimed, a soul trapped." "But why?" I asked, my mind reeling. "What's the point?" Blackwood stopped pacing, fixing me with a gaze that seemed to look right through me. "Power, boy. Pure, raw power. Each soul trapped feeds the forest spirit, makes it stronger, and in turn, it grants power to the one who wields the camera." I thought of the strange events that had plagued me since finding the camera, the near misses and odd occurrences. Had that been the spirit's power at work? So the spirit, the Wendigo or whatever it is, it's real? Blackwood nodded grimly. Oh, it's real, all right. Ancient and hungry and growing stronger with each soul it claims. And now it's set its sights on you. A chill ran down my spine at his words. I thought of the death photo I'd seen of myself, the ticking clock counting down to my demise. How do I stop it? I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. How do I break this curse? For a long moment, Blackwood was silent, his form flickering more rapidly. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with regret. There's only one way to end this, to stop the spirit and free all the souls trapped by the camera. You have to destroy it. Destroy the camera? I repeated. That's it? But Blackwood was shaking his head. It's not that simple, I'm afraid. The camera is tied to the spirit now, tied to the very essence of this forest. Destroying it won't be easy. And the spirit, it won't let go without a fight. He stepped closer to me, his eyes boring into mine. But there is another option. You could use the camera, claim its power for your own. With it, you could do incredible things. Save lives, change the world. I recoiled at the suggestion. At the cost of trapping innocent souls? Feeding some monstrous spirit? No way. Are you sure? Blackwood pressed. Think of the good you could do. The lives you could save. All it would cost is a few souls here and there. A small price to pay, some might say. For a moment, I hesitated. The thought of that power, of being able to change the world, was tempting. But then I thought of all the photos I'd seen, all the lives cut short. No, I said firmly. I won't do it. I won't become like you. Blackwood's expression hardened. Like me? Boy, you have no idea what I've sacrificed, what I've endured. I've spent decades trapped in this limbo, watching as soul after soul is claimed. Do you think I wanted this? His form was flickering more violently now, his voice rising to a shout. I created the camera to save my family, to bring back those I'd lost. Instead, I damned myself and countless others. And now you stand there, judging me. I stood my ground, even as the air around us seemed to crackle with otherworldly energy. I'm not judging you, I said, but I won't make the same mistake. I'm going to end this, one way or another. For a long moment, Blackwood glared at me, his form wavering between solid and translucent. Then suddenly he seemed to deflate, the anger draining out of him. Perhaps you're right, he sighed. Perhaps it's time for this nightmare to end. But be warned, destroying the camera won't be easy. The spirit will fight you every step of the way. Tell me what I need to do, I said. Blackwood nodded towards the dense forest beyond the clearing. There's a place deep in the heart of the woods. The locals call it the Hollow. It's where the spirit is strongest, where the boundary between worlds is thinnest. If you're going to destroy the camera, that's where you'll have to do it. The Hollow, I repeated, remembering the mark on the map I'd found. How will I know when I've found it? A grim smile crossed Blackwood's flickering face. Oh, you'll know. You'll feel it in your bones. But be careful. The closer you get to the Hollow, the stronger the spirit becomes. It'll try to stop you, to claim your soul before you can end this. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. I understand. Thank you for telling me the truth. Blackwood's form was fading now, becoming harder to see. Don't thank me yet, boy. The hardest part is still to come. And remember, the spirit will try to tempt you to turn you to its purpose. Stay strong. Don't let it win. As his last words faded away, so did Blackwood himself, leaving me alone in the clearing. The forest seemed darker now, more menacing. Every shadow held a potential threat, every rustle of leaves a warning. But I knew what I had to do. With a determined set to my jaw, I pulled out the map I'd taken from the cabin. The Hollow was marked deep in the heart of the forest, a journey that would likely take me the rest of the night. As I oriented myself and began to walk, I felt the weight of the camera in my bag. It seemed heavier now, as if it knew its time was coming to an end. "I'm coming for you," I muttered, unsure if I was addressing the camera, the spirit, or both. "This ends tonight." With that, I plunged deeper into the forest towards the hollow and the final confrontation that awaited me there. The night pressed in around me, full of whispers and shadows, but I pushed on. Whatever trials lay ahead, whatever temptations or terrors the spirit might throw at me, I was ready. One way or another, this long nightmare was going to end. The forest grew denser and darker as I made my way towards the hollow. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers trying to snag my clothes. The air grew thick and heavy, making each breath a struggle. As I pushed on, Blackwood's words echoed in my mind. The spirit would try to tempt me, he'd said, to turn me to its purpose. I steeled myself, determined to resist whatever tricks it might employ. But as the night wore on, doubt began to creep in. "You could do so much good," a voice whispered in my head. It sounded like my own thoughts, but somehow different. "Think of all the lives you could save." I shook my head, trying to clear it. "No," I muttered. "It's not worth the cost." But the voice persisted, growing louder with each step I took. "Is it not? One life traded for many? Isn't that a fair bargain?" Images began to flash before my eyes. I saw myself using the camera to stop accidents before they happened, to prevent murders, to save people from natural disasters. With each vision, the temptation grew stronger. I stumbled, catching myself against a tree. My hand came away sticky with sap, and for a moment it looked like blood in the dim light. "Stop it," I growled, unsure if I was addressing the spirit or myself. "This isn't real. It's just manipulation." But even as I said the words, doubt gnawed at me. What if I was making a mistake? What if destroying the camera meant giving up the chance to do real good in the world? I pushed on, my steps growing more uncertain. The forest around me seemed to shift and change, reality blurring at the edges. More than once I found myself walking in circles, always ending up back where I started. "You're lost," the voice in my head taunted. "But I can guide you. All you have to do is accept the gift I'm offering." I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to focus on the map. The hollow couldn't be far now. I just had to keep going, to resist the temptation for a little longer. But with each step, the visions grew more vivid, more enticing. I saw myself becoming a hero, using the camera's power to change the world for the better. Fame, fortune, adoration, all of it could be mine. "And all it would cost is a few souls," the voice whispered. "A small price to pay for the greater good, don't you think?" I stumbled into a clearing, my head spinning. As I looked around, trying to get my bearings, a chill ran down my spine. I recognized this place. It was the exact spot shown in my death photo. Panic surged through me. I spun around, half expecting to see the creature emerging from the shadows, but the clearing remained empty, silent save for the pounding of my own heart. "This is your last chance," the voice said, no longer a whisper, but a commanding presence in my mind. "Accept the power I'm offering, or face your fate." For a long moment, I stood frozen, wrestling with the decision. The allure of the camera's power gnawed at my conscience, clouding my judgment. It would be so easy to give in, to convince myself that I could use it for good. But then I thought of all the photos I'd seen, all the lives cut short. I thought of Blackwood, trapped for decades in a hell of his own making. And I knew what I had to do. "No," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I won't do it. I won't become like you." A howl of rage tore through the forest, making the trees themselves tremble. The air around me grew colder, and I could feel a malevolent presence pressing in from all sides. "Fool," the voice roared, no longer pretending to be my own thoughts. "You would throw away this gift? Then you will die like all the others. The shadows at the edge of the clearing began to coalesce, forming into a towering, monstrous shape. Antlers sprouted from its head and its eyes glowed with an otherworldly hunger. I stumbled backwards, fumbling for the camera in my bag. Not to use it, but to end this once and for all. As my fingers closed around the cold metal of the camera, a flicker of movement caught my eye. Blackwood's spirit had appeared at the edge of the clearing, his form wavering like a candle in the wind. "Now," he shouted, his voice faint and distant. "Destroy it now, before it's too late." The creature let out another bone-chilling howl and lunged towards me. In that moment, time seemed to slow. I saw its claws reaching for me, saw the hunger in its glowing eyes, and I knew that if I hesitated even for a second, it would all be over. With a cry of defiance, I pulled the camera from my bag and smashed it against a nearby rock. The effect was immediate and terrifying. A blinding light erupted from the shattered camera, accompanied by a sound like 1,000 voices screaming in unison. The creature recoiled, shrieking in pain and fury. Wind whipped through the clearing, nearly knocking me off my feet. I clung to the rock, squinting against the light as I watched the scene unfold before me. The creature was unraveling. There was no other word for it. Its form seemed to be breaking apart, wisps of shadow streaming away into the night. And with each piece that disappeared, I saw flashes of faces, all the souls it had consumed over the years. "No!" it roared, its voice a cacophony of 1,000 tortured souls. "You cannot do this. I am eternal. I am—" Its words cut off abruptly as its form collapsed entirely, imploding in a final burst of light and sound. When it faded, the clearing was empty, save for me and the fading spirit of Blackwood. I slumped to the ground, exhausted and shaken. For a long moment I just sat there, trying to process what had just happened. "It's over." Blackwood's voice came softly. I looked up to see his spirit growing fainter by the second. "You did it, my boy. You broke the curse." "What happens now?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Blackwood smiled, a look of peace settling over his features. "Now, we rest. All of us. Thank you for setting us free." And with that, he faded away entirely, leaving me alone in the clearing. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I slowly got to my feet. My body ached, and my mind was reeling from everything that had happened. But underneath it all was a profound sense of relief. It was over. The curse was broken, the souls set free. And I had resisted the temptation, had chosen to do what was right despite the cost. As I made my way out of the forest, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought me here. The fear, the doubt, the moments of temptation, all of it had led to this moment. I emerged from the tree line just as the sun crested the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of pink and gold. For the first time in what felt like ages, I took a deep, easy breath. The forest behind me was quiet now, peaceful in a way it hadn't been before. Whatever malevolent presence had haunted it was gone, banished by the destruction of the camera and the breaking of the curse. As I walked towards my cabin, I felt lighter somehow. The weight of the camera, of the curse, of the terrible choice I'd faced, all of it was gone. In its place was a quiet determination. I had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. And while the memory of that night would stay with me forever, I knew that I was stronger for having gone through it. The temptation had been great, the power offered almost irresistible, but in the end, I had chosen the harder path, the right path, and that, I realized, was a victory greater than any the camera could have offered. As I reached my cabin, I paused on the porch, looking back at the forest one last time. In the golden light of dawn, it looked almost ordinary, just trees and shadows, with no hint of the otherworldly horrors it had contained. But I knew better. I knew the power of choices, of resistance in the face of temptation. And I knew that sometimes the greatest victories are the ones no one else ever sees. With a small smile, I turned and went inside, ready to face whatever new challenges the future might bring. The nightmare was over, the temptation resisted, and I was finally, truly free. The world exploded in a blinding flash of white light. The force of it knocked me off my feet, sending me tumbling across the forest floor. For a moment, all I could see was that searing brightness. All I could hear was a high-pitched ringing in my ears. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. I found myself lying face down on the damp earth, the taste of dirt and leaves in my mouth. Slowly, groaning with the effort, I pushed myself up to my knees. My head was pounding, and every muscle in my body ached as if I'd run a marathon. "Blackwood?" I called out, my voice hoarse and shaky. "Are you there?" But no answer came. The clearing was silent, empty save for the soft rustling of leaves in the morning breeze. The old man's spirit was gone, along with the menacing presence that had haunted the forest for so long. As I got to my feet, I realized something had changed. The forest around me seemed different. The oppressive atmosphere, the sense of being watched by malevolent eyes, it was all gone. In its place was a quiet serenity, the kind of peace you'd expect to find in any ordinary woods. I took a deep breath, savoring the clean, crisp air. It felt like waking up from a long, terrible nightmare. "It's really over," I murmured to myself, a mixture of relief and disbelief washing over me. I glanced down at the shattered remains of the camera, scattered across the forest floor. Part of me wanted to gather up the pieces, to keep them as proof of what had happened. But a stronger part knew better. Whatever power had resided in that cursed device, it was better left here, in the depths of the forest, where it could never harm anyone again. With one last look around the clearing, I turned and began to make my way back towards town. The journey that had seemed so treacherous in the dark now felt almost pleasant in the early morning light. Birds were singing, small animals scurried through the underbrush, and shafts of sunlight painted dappled patterns on the forest floor. Yet despite the peaceful surroundings, I couldn't shake a lingering sense of unease. What would I find when I got back to town? Would anyone believe what had happened to me? And more importantly, what consequences would my actions have wrought? As I emerged from the tree line at the edge of town, everything looked normal at first glance. People were going about their morning routines, cars drove by. The world spun on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But as I made my way down Main Street, I began to notice small discrepancies. The bakery that had just opened last month now sported a sign celebrating its 5th anniversary. The old maple tree in the town square, which had been damaged in a storm last year, stood tall and whole. "What the hell?" I muttered, quickening my pace. My unease grew as I approached the old bookshop where I'd first found the camera. I'd been meaning to return to ask the owner if he knew anything about its origins, but as I rounded the corner, I stopped short in shock. The bookshop was boarded up, its windows covered with weathered planks. A faded "for sale" sign hung crookedly on the door. It looked as if it had been closed for years. "No, no, no," I said, shaking my head in disbelief. "This isn't right. This can't be happening." "You all right there, son?" a gruff voice asked from behind me. I spun around to find an elderly man watching me with concern. He leaned heavily on a cane, his bushy white eyebrows furrowed as he looked me up and down. The bookshop," I stammered. "When did it close?" The old man scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Oh, must be going on 5 years now. Old Tom passed away and his kids didn't want to keep the place running. Shame, really. Was a good spot. 5 years, but that was impossible. I'd been there just a few days ago. Unless... What's the date today?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The old man gave me an odd look, but answered anyway. "May 15th, 2028. You lose track of time or something, boy?" I felt the blood drain from my face. 2028. 5 years. Somehow, In destroying the camera and breaking the curse, I'd lost 5 years of my life. "Thank you," I managed to say to the old man before turning and walking away, my mind reeling. I made my way home in a daze, barely noticing my surroundings. When I reached my apartment building, I fumbled with my keys, half expecting them not to work. But the lock turned, and I stumbled inside. Everything looked the same as I'd left it, and yet different. A fine layer of dust covered every surface. The air was stale, as if the place hadn't been lived in for a long time. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching things hesitantly as if afraid they might disappear. When I reached my study, I paused at the door, my hand on the knob. This was where I'd kept all the photos from the camera, where I'd spent countless hours trying to unravel the mystery. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The room was empty. Not just of the photos, but of everything. The corkboards where I'd pinned my research, the stacks of books on the occult and local legends, the countless notes I'd scribbled. All of it was gone. The room looked as if it had never been used as anything but a spare bedroom. "This isn't possible," I whispered, sinking to my knees in the doorway. Had it all been a dream? Some elaborate hallucination? But no. It had felt too real, too vivid to be just a figment of my imagination. I don't know how long I sat there trying to make sense of what had happened. The sun had begun to set when I finally stirred, drawn from my stupor by the rumbling of my stomach. As I made my way to the kitchen, a glint of something on the coffee table caught my eye. I approached cautiously, half afraid of what I might find. There, in the center of the table, lay a single photograph. With trembling hands, I picked it up. It showed the clearing in the forest where I'd destroyed the camera. But instead of the nightmarish scene I remembered, it depicted a peaceful glade bathed in morning light. And there, at the edge of the frame, was a familiar figure. Elias Blackwood, no longer a flickering spirit, but solid and real, a look of profound peace on his face. I turned the photo over. On the back, in neat handwriting I didn't recognize, was a simple message. "Thank you for setting us free." The price was high, but the alternative was unthinkable. Live well, and remember, choices have consequences, but it's what we do with those consequences that defines us. E.B. I sank onto the couch, the photo clutched to my chest. Tears I didn't even realize I'd been holding back began to flow freely. 5 years. I'd lost 5 years of my life. But in doing so, I'd saved countless others. I'd put an end to a cycle of death and suffering that had persisted for decades. As the last light of day faded outside my window, I made a decision. I couldn't change what had happened, couldn't reclaim the time I'd lost, but I could choose what to do with the time I had left. I would live. I would make every moment count. And I would never forget the lesson I'd learned in those dark woods, that sometimes the greatest heroism lies not in grand gestures, but in the quiet choice to do what's right, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, I stood up and walked to the window. The town stretched out before me, lights twinkling in the gathering darkness. It was the same place I'd always known, and yet entirely new. "Well," I said to myself, a small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth, "I guess it's time to start living again." And with that, I turned away from the window and began to plan for tomorrow. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever consequences my actions had set in motion, I was ready to face them. After all, I'd faced down a forest spirit and lived to tell the tale. How hard could the rest of life be? As I settled in for my first night back in the world, I couldn't help but chuckle at the thought. Something told me that the adventures were far from over. They were just beginning. Days melted into weeks, and slowly, a sense of normalcy began to creep back into my life. The initial shock of losing 5 years had faded, replaced by a determination to make the most of every moment I had left. I threw myself into work, reconnected with old friends, and tried to build a life that felt, well, normal. But normal, I was discovering, was a relative term. On a crisp autumn morning, I found myself once again at the edge of the forest. I'd avoided it for weeks after my return, the memories still too raw, too vivid. But today something drew me back. Maybe it was a need for closure, or maybe just curiosity. Whatever it was, I found myself lacing up my hiking boots and heading into the woods. As I walked along the familiar trails, I was struck by how different everything looked in the daylight, without the weight of curse and destiny hanging over me. The trees that had once seemed menacing now stood tall and proud, their leaves a riot of red and gold. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, painting dappled patterns on the forest floor. "It's beautiful," I murmured to myself, pausing to take in the view. And it was. For the first time, I could see the forest for what it truly was. Not a place of darkness and danger, but a living, breathing ecosystem, full of life and beauty. I hiked for hours, rediscovering trails I'd once known like the back of my hand. As the day wore on, I found myself approaching the clearing where it had all ended, or begun, depending on how you looked at it. The clearing was peaceful now, carpeted with fallen leaves and late-blooming wildflowers. No trace remained of the cosmic battle that had taken place here. No shattered camera parts, no lingering sense of otherworldly presence. Just a quiet glade in the heart of the forest. I sat down on a fallen log, letting out a long breath. "It really is over," I said aloud, feeling a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying lift from my shoulders. As if in response, a breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of pine and earth. I closed my eyes, savoring the moment of perfect tranquility. That's when I heard it. A faint click, like the shutter of a camera. My eyes snapped open, heart suddenly racing, but the clearing was empty, silent save for the usual forest sounds. I shook my head, chuckling nervously. "Get a grip," I muttered. "You're jumping at shadows." Still, the moment had broken the spell. I stood, stretching out muscles stiff from sitting, and began to make my way back towards town. As I emerged from the tree line, the modern world reasserted itself. Cars honked in the distance, and the chatter of people going about their day filled the air. I breathed deeply, grounding myself in the here and now. I was nearly home when a flickering image on a storefront TV caught my eye. It was a news report, the anchor's voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the street. In local news, a hiker made an unusual discovery in Willow Creek Forest today. I froze, my blood running cold. It couldn't be. It was impossible. I pressed closer to the window, straining to hear. Found an old camera, believed to be several decades old. Experts are baffled by its unusual design. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I staggered back, my mind reeling. It wasn't possible. I'd destroyed the camera. I'd broken the curse, hadn't I? Before I knew what I was doing, I was running. I had to find that hiker. Had to stop this before it started all over again. I burst into the local police station, startling the desk sergeant. "The hiker," I gasped out of breath. "The one who found the camera. Where are they?" The sergeant blinked at me, confusion written across his face. "Sir, I'm going to need you to calm down and explain." "There's no time," I shouted, earning concerned looks from everyone in the station. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Please," I said more calmly. "It's important. Where's the hiker?" After what felt like an eternity of questions and suspicious looks, I finally got my answer. The hiker, a local woman named Sarah Chen, had brought the camera to the Historical Society for examination. I raced across town, my mind churning with possibilities. How had the camera survived? Was it the same one, somehow reassembled? Or was it a different camera, another of Blackwood's creations? The Historical Society was housed in an old Victorian mansion on the edge of town. I took the steps two at a time, bursting through the front door with enough force to make the receptionist jump. "Sarah Chen," I panted. "The hiker, where is she?" The receptionist pointed wordlessly down a hallway, too startled to speak. I nodded my thanks and took off at a run. I found Sarah in a small examination room, bent over a table with an older man I recognized as the society's curator. And there, between them, was the camera. It looked exactly as I remembered, the same antiquated design, the same strange symbols etched into its casing. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached. "Don't touch it," I cried out, causing both Sarah and the curator to whirl around in surprise. "Excuse me, who are you?" the curator demanded, but I ignored him, my eyes fixed on the camera. "Sarah," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "I know this is going to sound crazy, but you need to give me that camera. It's dangerous." Sarah's eyes widened. "Dangerous? It's just an old camera. What are you talking about?" I took a step closer, my hand outstretched. "Please, you have to trust me. That camera, it's not what you think it is. It's cursed." The curator scoffed. "Young man, I think you've been watching too many horror movies. This is a valuable historical artifact, not some prop from a ghost story." But Sarah was looking at me more closely now, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "How do you know about this?" she asked. "The news report only came out an hour ago." I swallowed hard. "Because I've seen it before, used it before. Trust me, nothing good can come from that camera." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then slowly, Sarah picked up the camera. My breath caught in my throat as she turned it over in her hands. "It does feel strange," she admitted, "like it's heavier than it should be." "Sarah, don't listen to this lunatic," the curator protested, but she ignored him. Instead, she held the camera out to me. "Here," she said. "If you're so sure it's dangerous, you take it." Relief flooded through me as I reached for the camera, but as my fingers brushed its cold metal surface, something impossible happened. The shutter clicked. A flash of light momentarily blinded me. As my vision cleared, I saw a photo sliding out of the camera. With trembling hands, I plucked it from the air. And there, in perfect, terrible detail, was my own death scene. The same image I'd seen all those years ago, the one that had started this whole nightmare. "No," I whispered, my voice breaking. "No, this can't be happening." Sarah and the curator were saying something, their voices rising in alarm, but I couldn't hear them over the roaring in my ears. The photo felt heavy in my hands, a death sentence rendered in silver nitrate and paper. As the reality of the situation sank in, I realized a terrible truth. Some cycles can never truly be broken. The camera was back. The curse was alive. And once again, I found myself at the center of it all. I looked up, meeting Sarah's worried gaze. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice hollow. "I thought I'd ended this, but I was wrong. It's starting all over again." "What's starting?" Sarah asked, fear creeping into her voice. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. "It's a long story," I said, "and you're not going to believe most of it. But I need you to listen, because if we don't stop this now, people are going to die." As I began to recount my tale, I could see the disbelief in their eyes slowly give way to horror. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood red. Night was falling, and with it, the start of a new nightmare. But this time, I wasn't alone. This time I had knowledge, experience, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to truly end this once and for all. As I finished my story, I looked from Sarah to the curator and back again. "So," I said, my voice grim but determined, "who's ready to save the world?" The camera sat between us, a silent promise of the terrors to come. But as I looked at it now, I felt something I hadn't before. Not fear, but resolve. Whatever happened next, whatever horrors we might face, I was ready.